Okay, so you're watching this, maybe you're interested in history, maybe you're just bored. Either way, let's talk about childbirth in the 17th century. But first, let's take a deep breath. Imagine yourself gently easing out of your own time, slipping back through the years like drifting off to sleep. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Now imagine the technology you have right now vanishes. The internet, gone, the cars, the electricity, but also think on all the things you never think about that are gone, like really gone, and that includes modern medicine. It's a scary thought, right? We take so much for granted that antibiotics will fight infection, that a doctor can quickly diagnose a problem with fancy scans and blood tests, that pain relief during childbirth is even possible, let alone expected. But in the 1600s, all of that, dream on. For us today, pregnancy is often a planned, monitored, medically assisted experience. We get ultrasounds, genetic screenings, regular checkups. We know, with pretty good accuracy, when that little bundle is due, and we can prepare accordingly. And even if something goes wrong, there's an emergency room right around the corner where highly trained doctors and nurses can handle almost anything. Now, slam on the brakes, because you've just warped back to 17th century Europe or colonial America, and none of that exists. The first shock? Just knowing you're pregnant. No pee sticks, no blood tests. You'd have to rely on, well, feeling it. Morning sickness, that lovely friend, missed periods, sure, but those could also be caused by any number of other things. Stress, poor diet, just life. So a woman might not be entirely sure she was expecting for months, sometimes well into the pregnancy. Think of the anxiety, the uncertainty. It's hard for us to imagine not knowing for so long, right? And once she did suspect, what then? No doctor's appointment, no reassuring heartbeat on a Doppler. Instead, she would turn to her female relatives, her friends, maybe the local midwife. They'd rely on intuition, mostly. Feeling the abdomen, looking for changes in her appearance. It was all a bit hit or miss. But then, the bigger shock really starts to hit you. The complete lack of understanding about how babies are even made. I mean, people knew that sex had something to do with it, obviously. But the details? The actual biology of conception, pretty much a mystery. No one knew about sperm, about eggs, about genetics. They didn't understand the process of fertilization or how the baby developed inside the womb. And that lack of knowledge had huge consequences. It meant that prenatal care as we know it didn't exist. No advice about nutrition, no warnings about alcohol or smoking. Just keep working, keep praying, and hope for the best. Then there's the constant fear. Today, we know that childbirth is generally safe, especially with access to modern medical care. But in the 17th century, it was a leading cause of death for women. Just think about that. Simply having a baby could kill you. And it wasn't just about the pain, which we'll get to. Oh boy, will we get to that in a later section. It was about the complications. Infections were rampant. Hemorrhage was a constant threat. Breech births where the baby comes out feet first were often fatal, and you could only try to turn the child inside. And if something went wrong, there was very little anyone could do. No C-sections, no blood transfusions, no antibiotics. The midwife might try her best, using her knowledge of herbs and traditional techniques, but often she was powerless to stop the inevitable. Think about that weight of worry that would crush an expectant mother in the 1600s, not knowing whether she or her baby would survive the ordeal. And imagine the grief when those fears became reality. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high. Many families lost children, again and again. It was a grim reality that everyone accepted, even though it must have been agonizing. For us today, the death of a child is seen as a tragedy, an unthinkable loss. In the 17th century, it was simply part of life. And that difference in perspective, that acceptance of loss, is perhaps the most jarring thing of all. So you're standing there now, back in this world without modern medicine. You are pregnant. You're tired, nauseous, and terrified. You have little information, limited resources, and a very real chance that you might not make it through this. Welcome to childbirth in the 17th century. Buckle up, because this is going to be a bumpy ride. Pregnancy in the 17th century. It wasn't quite the joyous, highly documented experience it is for many today. Imagine a world with no ultrasounds, no home pregnancy tests, and very little understanding of basic biology as it relates to reproduction. Scary, right? But even scarier was the weight of expectation placed upon women during this period. Let's gently unpack that, shall we? For starters, pregnancy wasn't necessarily seen as a good thing right off the bat, especially for unmarried women. In fact, illegitimacy was a huge societal problem in the 17th century. Depending on the region and social standing, an unwed mother could face shame, ostracization, or even legal punishment. We're talking public humiliation, fines, even imprisonment. The focus was less on the woman's well-being and more on the sin she had committed and the disruption to social order she represented. Sadly, the child born from this was often seen as bearing the stigma. But even within marriage, pregnancy was far from a purely personal experience. It was deeply intertwined with societal and familial expectations. A woman's primary role was to bear children, preferably sons, to continue the family line and secure its economic future. In other words, her value was often directly linked to her fertility and the success of her pregnancies. No pressure, right? And remember, this wasn't just about carrying on the family name, although that was a huge part. Sons inherited land, titles, and businesses. Daughters, while valued, didn't have the same economic weight to the family as sons. Think about families with large estates or aristocratic titles. Their entire power structure hinged on having a male heir. If a woman failed to produce a son, it could lead to immense pressure, marital strife, and even accusations of witchcraft in extreme cases. Because logically, she must be the problem. It couldn't possibly be the man, could it? Sigh. And let's not forget about infant mortality. It was tragically high. So even if a woman conceived and carried a child to term, there was no guarantee that the baby would survive. This constant threat of loss hung over every pregnancy, adding another layer of anxiety and uncertainty. You would go through months of pregnancy, labor, and then not even be guaranteed a living child at the end of it. The prevailing belief was that pregnancy was a natural, albeit dangerous, state. It was seen as a woman's lot in life. Therefore, there was often little emphasis on special care or accommodations. Pregnant women were expected to continue with their daily routines as long as possible, which, depending on their social class, could involve back-breaking labor. Can you imagine working in the fields or scrubbing laundry while heavily pregnant? It was incredibly common. And the concept of maternity leave, non-existent. A woman might take a few days or weeks after childbirth to recover, but she was quickly expected to resume her duties. It wasn't uncommon for women to be caring for multiple young children while simultaneously pregnant with another. Talk about being stretched thin. Adding to all of this, the beliefs about the cause of pregnancy and what affected the fetus were often based on superstition rather than scientific knowledge. What a mother ate, saw, or experienced during pregnancy was believed to have a direct impact on the child's physical and mental characteristics. So a pregnant woman might be encouraged to look at beautiful things to ensure her child was born with beauty, or to avoid certain foods believed to cause birth defects. This meant pregnant women lived in a world of constant vigilance, trying to control every aspect of their environment to ensure the health and well-being of their unborn child. And who gave this advice? Well, it wasn't doctors. Mostly, it was older women in the family, neighbors, and midwives. They passed down knowledge and a lot of old wives' tales from generation to generation. Some of this knowledge was genuinely helpful based on practical experience. Other bits were just plain wrong. There was also a strong religious element to pregnancy. It was seen as a blessing from God, and childbirth was often described as a test of faith. Women were encouraged to pray for a safe delivery and to trust in God's will. And if things went wrong, well, that could be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure, adding a heavy dose of guilt and fear to an already stressful situation. It's also worth noting that attitudes towards pregnancy varied based on social class. Wealthy women had access to better food, more comfortable living conditions, and sometimes the care of physicians, though, as we'll see, that wasn't always a good thing. They might also have the option of hiring wet nurses to breastfeed their babies, allowing them to recover more quickly and potentially conceive again sooner. Poor women, on the other hand, faced significantly greater challenges. They often lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions, had limited access to food and medical care, and were forced to work throughout their pregnancies and shortly after childbirth. They also faced a higher risk of complications due to malnutrition, infection, and exhaustion. And let's not forget about the lack of privacy. Pregnancy and childbirth were very public events in the 17th century. Women were surrounded by female relatives and neighbors during labor, and their experiences were openly discussed within the community. This lack of privacy could be comforting in some ways, providing emotional support and shared knowledge, but it also meant that women had little control over their own bodies or their birthing experiences. So when you picture a pregnant woman in the 17th century, don't think of glowing maternity photos or carefully curated baby showers. Think of a woman carrying the weight of societal expectations, navigating a world of superstition and uncertainty, and facing the very real possibility of death in childbirth. It was a tough time to be pregnant, to say the least. All right, let's settle in and talk about the backbone of 17th century childbirth, the midwife. In an age long before hospitals and even before male doctors were commonly involved in deliveries, midwives were the unsung heroes, the primary caregivers, the wise women who ushered new life into the world. They held an incredibly important and respected position within their communities, and their understanding of pregnancy and childbirth, while different from our modern medicalized view, was built upon generations of practical experience and observation. So what exactly did a midwife do? Well, pretty much everything related to pregnancy and childbirth. Think of them as the family doctors of their time, but specializing in the miracle of life. From the moment a woman suspected she was pregnant, she would turn to the midwife for guidance. They provided advice on diet and lifestyle during pregnancy, offered comfort and support, and prepared the expectant mother for the ordeal to come. And of course, when the time came, they oversaw the entire labor and delivery process. But it didn't stop there. Midwives were also responsible for the immediate postpartum care of both mother and child. They helped the new mother recover, assisted with breastfeeding, and monitored the baby's health. They also had a role in rituals like purification and the afterbirth, disposing of it by burning or burial to avoid sorcerous use. In essence, they were a one-stop shop for all things maternal and infant. Now, how did someone become a midwife in the 17th century? Well, there certainly wasn't any formal schooling like we have today. Instead, midwifery was typically a skill passed down through families, from mother to daughter, or learned through apprenticeships with experienced midwives. Imagine sitting at the feet of a seasoned expert, watching, listening, and learning from years of hands-on practice. This kind of learning also allowed knowledge to adjust with practical knowledge. These apprenticeships could last for several years, providing ample opportunity to absorb the knowledge and skills necessary to practice independently. In some areas, midwives were also required to obtain a license from the local bishop or town council, demonstrating their competence and good character. This licensing process often involved an examination where they would be questioned on their understanding of anatomy, physiology, and common childbirth complications. It's important to remember that the 17th century understanding of anatomy and physiology was, shall we say, rather different from our own. They didn't have access to X-rays or ultrasound, and their knowledge of the inner workings of the body was based primarily on observation and dissection of animals, and sometimes even humans. Galen, the 2nd century Greek physician, was still widely believed. Humoral theory, which posited that the body was governed by 4 humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, was another key framework for understanding health and disease. Midwives sought to maintain balance. Despite these limitations, midwives possessed a wealth of practical knowledge about childbirth. They understood the different stages of labor, how to position the mother for optimal delivery, and how to manage common complications like breech births or retained placentas. They were skilled in the use of herbal remedies to ease pain, induce labor, or stop bleeding. And perhaps most importantly, they provided emotional support and encouragement to the laboring mother, offering a calm and reassuring presence during what was often a frightening and painful experience. Their understanding of anatomy was far from perfect, but some were actually quite savvy and knowledgeable in how the body functioned. They gained this through observing many women's bodies, and were adept at palpating the abdomen to understand the baby's position. Manual rotation of a breech baby was not uncommon at this time, and many midwives had the skill to perform this dangerous operation. Now, it's easy to dismiss their knowledge as simply old wives' tales or folklore. But it's important to remember that these women were keen observers. They had a deep understanding of the human body and the natural world, and their practices were often based on sound empirical evidence, passed down through generations of trial and error, and their practices sometimes worked. Also, it's important to remember that medical texts at the time weren't exactly that great either. The famous book, Aristotle's masterpiece, was full of crazy ideas, and some doctors were not much better. It's difficult for us to imagine, but there was no real consensus on the right way to deliver a baby, even among educated physicians. The tools of a midwife in the 17th century were relatively simple but effective. A birthing stool, a low seat with a cutout in the center, was often used to help the mother assume an upright position during labor. Linen cloths were used for cleaning and support. Herbal preparations were kept on hand to manage pain and encourage labor. And of course, their own skilled hands were their most valuable tool. And let's not forget the social role of the midwife. She wasn't just a medical practitioner, she was a respected member of the community, a confidant, and a source of support for women during a vulnerable time. She was often called upon to settle disputes between families, to offer advice on marital matters, and to provide comfort during times of grief. She was in many ways the heart and soul of her community. The role of the midwife also extended to legal matters. Because births almost always happened at home, the midwife was usually the first witness to the event. As such, she often played a crucial role in documenting births and establishing paternity, particularly in cases where inheritance or legitimacy were in question. She might be called upon to testify in court, providing evidence about the circumstances of the birth and the identity of the parents. But the life of a midwife wasn't always easy. They often worked long hours, traveling miles on foot or horseback to attend births, regardless of the weather or the time of day. They faced the constant risk of infection, both for themselves and their patients, and they had to deal with the emotional toll of witnessing both the joy of new life and the heartbreak of stillbirth or maternal death. Despite these challenges, midwifery was a valued and respected profession in the 17th century. Midwives provided essential care to women and their families, and their knowledge and skills were vital to the health and well-being of their communities. They were the unsung heroes of their time, the wise women who helped bring new life into the world, one baby at a time. Their contribution to history is often overlooked but deeply important. Okay, so let's talk about how expectant mothers in the 17th century managed their pregnancies. Remember, this was a world without prenatal vitamins, ultrasounds, or even a clear understanding of germ theory. Instead, they relied on a fascinating and sometimes frightening mix of herbal remedies and deeply ingrained superstitions. Imagine you're a woman in the 1600s realizing you're with child. Excitement, yes, but also a healthy dose of anxiety. You wouldn't be rushing off to a modern doctor. Your first port of call would likely be the village midwife, or perhaps a knowledgeable older woman in the family. These women held the accumulated wisdom, both practical and, let's be honest, pretty out there, about pregnancy and childbirth. Herbal remedies were a cornerstone of prenatal care, and some of them actually had a basis in reality. Think of it as the early days of pharmacology, even though the scientific understanding was, well, a little limited. For morning sickness, which was often called the qualms of pregnancy, various soothing herbs were prescribed. Mint, ginger, and chamomile infusions were common. These could actually help settle the stomach, offering some real relief. Rue, though, was another common remedy for morning sickness, but it could be dangerous as it can cause uterine contractions. So a bit of a mixed bag, right? To strengthen the womb, a phrase you'd hear a lot, women drank infusions of vervain and motherwort. These herbs were believed to tone the uterus and prevent miscarriage. Again, while we don't have definitive scientific proof of their efficacy in that regard, both herbs do have some properties that could have been beneficial, such as anti-inflammatory and calming effects. Other herbal concoctions were aimed at alleviating specific pregnancy discomforts, swollen ankles, try a poultice of marshmallow, constipation, a prune or senna infusion might do the trick. For sleep problems, a lavender sachet under the pillow or a cup of poppy seed tea was sometimes recommended. Though the tea can be quite risky, poppy seeds are, of course, derived from the opium poppy and could be addictive, even deadly. But it wasn't all grounded in practical observation. Superstition played a massive role, permeating every aspect of life, and pregnancy was no exception. A pregnant woman was seen as being in a liminal state, a bridge between worlds, making her particularly vulnerable to supernatural influences, both good and bad. For example, it was widely believed that a pregnant woman's cravings had to be satisfied, or the baby would be born with a birthmark resembling the desired food. So if she craved strawberries and couldn't get them, her baby might have a strawberry-shaped mark. Seemed logical enough at the time, right? Then there were the charms and amulets. To ward off evil spirits and ensure a safe delivery, women wore necklaces of amber, coral, or jet. These stones were believed to possess protective powers. Some wore small bags filled with herbs and spices, like cloves, cinnamon, and rosemary, to create a fragrant shield against bad luck. Dreams were also considered highly significant. A dream about clear water was a good omen, suggesting a healthy baby. A dream about muddy water, on the other hand, could foretell complications. Dreams of fruit were usually associated with a female child, while dreams of weapons suggested a male. Certain animals were also imbued with symbolic meaning. Seeing a cat cross your path while pregnant was considered unlucky, potentially bringing illness to the child. Rabbits, often associated with fertility, were generally viewed favorably, but seeing a dead rabbit was a definite cause for concern. Dietary restrictions were common, often based on folklore rather than nutritional science. Eating hair was thought to cause the baby to be born with a hair lip. Consuming eels could lead to a slippery delivery, which, well, that one's actually kind of funny, isn't it? Strong-smelling foods like garlic were considered a no-go, as it was believed that their scent could taint the amniotic fluid. Pregnant women were also advised to avoid certain activities. Attending funerals was discouraged, as it was thought the sorrowful atmosphere could negatively affect the baby. Looking at ugly or deformed people was also a big no-no, as it was believed the baby might be born with similar features, and definitely no watching executions. That could lead to all sorts of problems. The position of the stars and planets was also considered crucial. Astrologers were sometimes consulted to determine the most auspicious time for the birth, or to cast a horoscope for the unborn child, predicting its future. These horoscopes could influence decisions about the child's upbringing and education. Now, let's be clear, many of these beliefs were based on superstition and lacked any scientific validity. But they provided a sense of control and comfort in a world where childbirth was inherently dangerous. By following these rituals and adhering to these beliefs, women felt they were doing everything in their power to protect themselves and their babies. The reliance on herbal remedies and superstitions highlights the resourcefulness and ingenuity of women in the 17th century, navigating pregnancy in the absence of modern medicine. It was a world where practical knowledge and folklore intertwined, shaping the birthing experience in profound ways. And honestly, when you consider the lack of viable alternatives, it's hard to blame them for clinging to any belief that offered even a sliver of hope and control in the face of the unknown. Alright, let's settle into what might seem like a cozy scene, but trust me, it was anything but the birthing chamber of the 17th century. Now, we might picture a bright, airy room with gentle music playing. Instead, imagine a room chosen for practicality, warmth, and seclusion. Often this would be the main bedroom of the house, or if space was limited, a corner of the main living area, temporarily screened off for privacy. Think dimly lit. Candles were precious, and windows were often small, covered with oiled paper or heavy cloth to keep out drafts. Sunlight was welcome, sure, but more important was keeping the room warm, especially during colder months. Drafts were considered dangerous, capable of carrying illness and weakening the mother. So, stuffy and a little dark is the vibe we're going for. The centerpiece, of course, was the birthing bed. This wasn't a specialized piece of furniture. It was typically the family's regular bed, maybe given a little extra padding with straw or feather-filled mattresses. Cleanliness, well, that was relative. Sheets and blankets were changed, of course, but remember, hygiene standards were vastly different. Think more along the lines of wiping away visible dirt than a surgical level of sterilization, which was centuries away from being understood. Around the bed, you'd find a collection of items deemed essential for the labor. We're talking practical things, like basins filled with water, hopefully warm, for washing the mother, and linens, lots and lots of linen cloths. Cleanliness being relative, and all, the more cloths the better. Sponges, most likely natural sea sponges if they were affordable, for applying cool water to the mother's forehead. Then there were the less practical, shall we say, items. Amulets and charms were common, intended to ward off evil spirits and protect the mother and child. These could be anything from religious medals to oddly shaped stones believed to possess protective powers. Superstition played a huge role in 17th century life, and childbirth was a time when people clung to anything that might offer a little extra security, real or imagined. Herbal remedies would also be present. Midwives were skilled in using herbs to ease pain, induce labor, or staunch bleeding. We'll delve deeper into those later, but picture bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters or arranged in earthenware pots, ready to be brewed into teas or poultices. Speaking of pots, you'd also find a birthing stool. This was a low stool, often with a crescent-shaped cutout, that allowed the midwife to have better access during delivery. Some women preferred to give birth sitting upright, believing it aided the process. If a birthing stool wasn't available, the woman might lean against the midwife or another woman for support. Fire was essential. A fireplace or brazier would be kept burning to provide warmth, boil water, and cook food for the laboring woman and those attending her. The flickering light also added to the already dim ambience, creating a sense of intimacy and seclusion. Family and friends would be close by. Childbirth was rarely a solitary event. The mother would be surrounded by female relatives, neighbors, and of course the midwife. These women provided physical support, emotional comfort, and practical assistance. They'd offer words of encouragement, wipe away sweat, and help the mother change positions. Think of it as a team effort, a communal experience shared by women who understood the challenges and risks of childbirth. The atmosphere in the birthing chamber would be charged with anticipation, anxiety, and a deep sense of purpose. There would be hushed whispers, murmured prayers, and the occasional groan or cry from the laboring woman. The air would be thick with the smells of sweat, herbs, and burning candles. As labor progressed, the room might become more chaotic. Linens would be soiled, water would be spilled, and the sounds of labor would intensify. But through it all, there would be a sense of unwavering support and determination. These women were united in their goal to bring a new life safely into the world. Preparing the birthing chamber wasn't just about arranging the physical space. It was about creating a safe, supportive environment where the mother could feel as comfortable and secure as possible, given the circumstances. It was a blend of practical preparations, superstitious beliefs, and communal support, all aimed at navigating the perilous journey of childbirth in a world without modern medicine. It really was all they could do. All of this had to be arranged in advance, of course. As soon as a woman's pregnancy became obvious, these arrangements would begin, with neighbors coming in to assist with larger tasks like cleaning. Because it wasn't just setting up a room, it was organizing a support network. So next time you think about childbirth in the 17th century, try to imagine this scene: the dimly lit room, the flickering candlelight, the hushed whispers, the blend of practical and superstitious preparations, and the unwavering support of the women gathered around the birthing bed. It's a world away from modern hospitals and epidurals, but it's a world that shaped our history and deserves to be remembered. A dark world, but filled with humanity. Okay, so imagine labor in the 17th century. No epidurals, no laughing gas, none of the modern pain relief we take for granted. It's intense to even think about, isn't it? But women did cope. They found ways to manage the pain, drawing on a mix of herbal remedies, deep-seated faith, and the unwavering support of other women. Let's gently explore some of these methods. First, let's talk about herbs. Herbalism was a huge part of everyday life back then, and midwives possessed a wealth of knowledge about plants and their properties. Certain herbs were believed to ease labor pains, though it's important to remember that scientific understanding was different. What might have been effective could also have been simply a placebo, offering psychological comfort more than anything else. One common remedy was mugwort. It was thought to stimulate contractions, but also to have a calming effect. It's almost like a gentle nudge for the body, if that makes sense. Then there's pennyroyal, though it's important to mention that pennyroyal can be quite dangerous in high doses, so midwives would have used it with extreme caution, if at all primarily in an attempt to stimulate menstruation, if pregnancy was not desired. These herbs weren't necessarily about eliminating pain, but more about easing the process, perhaps shortening the labor. Other herbs were used to promote relaxation. Chamomile, for instance, was often brewed into a tea. It has a soothing quality, doesn't it? And even in our modern world, we turn to it for calming our nerves. And let's not forget lavender. Its scent alone can be so comforting. It would have been used in oils, perhaps rubbed onto the mother's temples or added to warm compresses. Of course, it's important to remember that the efficacy of these herbs is, it's debated. Modern science hasn't necessarily validated all of these uses, and some herbs could have interacted with the pregnancy in unexpected ways. But the belief in their power, the ritual of preparing and administering them, that in itself could have provided a sense of control and comfort during a very overwhelming experience. It's the power of intention, almost. Beyond herbs, prayer played a massive role. Religion was deeply ingrained in 17th century life. and childbirth was viewed as a profoundly spiritual event. Women would often turn to prayer for strength, for guidance, and for the well-being of both herself and the child. It was a way to surrender to something larger than themselves, to find solace in their faith during immense physical distress. They might have recited specific prayers, perhaps asking for the intercession of a patron saint associated with childbirth, or simply spoken from the heart, expressing their fears and hopes. The act of praying, of connecting with God, could have offered a sense of peace, a feeling that they weren't alone in their suffering. It was a way to tap into a source of inner strength, wouldn't you agree? And let's not underestimate the power of emotional support. Childbirth in the 17th century was very much a communal experience. The birthing chamber would have been filled with women, the midwife of course, but also female relatives, friends and neighbors. These women weren't just passive observers, they were active participants in the process. They offered words of encouragement, they held the mother's hand, they provided physical comfort like cool cloths or sips of water. Their presence was a source of reassurance, a reminder that the woman wasn't alone in her pain. They had all been through it themselves, or would go through it, creating a bond of shared experience. It was a sisterhood really, a circle of women offering strength and solidarity during a very vulnerable time, and that alone must have been incredibly powerful. Think about it, holding another woman's hand, looking into her eyes, giving her encouraging words. It provides physical and emotional connection that we can all relate to. Being witnessed is a powerful tool for pain, and those women were seen. The midwife in particular played a critical role in providing emotional support. She wasn't just a medical practitioner, she was also a counselor, a confidant, and a source of unwavering encouragement. She would have stayed with the woman throughout the entire labor, offering guidance and reassurance every step of the way. She would have known when to push, when to rest, and when to simply offer a comforting word. There were other methods too, less tangible perhaps, but still important. Some women found comfort in movement, walking around the room, rocking back and forth. Others preferred stillness, focusing on their breath, trying to find a rhythm that helped them cope with the contractions. The idea of birthing positions as we know them now wasn't necessarily formalized, but women instinctively found positions that offered them some relief. And then there's the power of distraction. Anything that could take the woman's mind off the pain, even for a moment, could have been helpful. Singing, storytelling, gentle massage, even just focusing on a familiar object in the room. These could have provided brief respites from the intensity of labor. It's important to remember that pain is subjective, and everyone experiences it differently. What worked for one woman might not have worked for another. And what might seem like a small thing to us, a comforting word, a cool cloth, a familiar scent, could have made a world of difference to a woman in labor in the 17th century. It's also important to acknowledge that, despite all these efforts, childbirth in the 17th century was often a terrifying and traumatic experience. Pain was simply a part of it, an unavoidable aspect of bringing new life into the world. And while these methods could have helped to manage the pain, they couldn't eliminate it entirely. We can also consider stoicism, or the expectation that a woman should bear her burden and not be too emotional. It is possible that many women were simply quiet and bore their suffering with dignity, even if they wanted to scream and shout. It may have been more challenging to lean into pain without modern medicine if you also had to lean into grace too. Perhaps the most important takeaway is this: women in the 17th century were incredibly resilient. They faced childbirth with courage, with faith, and with the unwavering support of other women. They drew on a mix of herbal remedies, prayer, and emotional connection to manage the pain and bring new life into the world. And while we can never fully understand what it was like to experience childbirth without modern analgesics, we can certainly admire their strength and their resilience. It is truly remarkable when we think about it. Just the sheer force of will, of life, that persevered. Alright, let's settle in and talk about the real nitty-gritty, the labor process itself, a step-by-step account of what a typical birth might have looked like in the 17th century. Now, keep in mind, typical is doing a lot of work here. Every birth is unique, and the details could vary wildly, but we can paint a general picture based on historical accounts and what we know of medical understanding at the time. So, let's imagine our expectant mother. For weeks, perhaps months, she's felt the increasing weight and discomfort of her growing child. She's probably endured morning sickness, fatigue, and the general anxieties that accompany pregnancy even today. But unlike today, she hasn't had regular ultrasounds or detailed doctor's visits. Her midwife might have felt her belly to get a sense of the baby's position, but much of what she knows is based on feeling and intuition, guided by the wisdom passed down through generations. When labor actually begins, it often starts subtly. These early signs could easily be mistaken for indigestion or just another ache. The first stage is all about the cervix. That's the opening to the uterus, gradually softening, thinning, what they'd call effacing if they knew the term, and dilating. Think of it like slowly stretching a tight rubber band. In this period, our mother might experience mild, irregular contractions. They might feel like period cramps, a dull ache in her back, or a general tightening of her abdomen. She might also notice the show, a mucus plug that seals the cervix during pregnancy. Its expulsion is a sign that things are progressing. This early stage can be long, sometimes lasting for days, especially for a first-time mother. There's a lot of waiting and watching. The midwife would be called in, maybe not immediately, but certainly as the contractions became more regular and intense. She would assess the situation, offering comfort and reassurance. Home would be prepared with soft linens, warmed blankets, and a birthing stool pulled close to the fire. Family would gather to lend support and prepare food and drink for the laboring mother and midwife. As time passes, the contractions become stronger, longer, and more frequent. This is when things start getting real. Now, imagine this: no epidural, no pain medication as we know it. Pain management in the 17th century relied on a mix of herbal remedies, emotional support and distraction. A strong brew of chamomile or other calming herbs might be offered. Warm compresses would ease back pain. The midwife and family members would provide constant encouragement, reminding the mother of her strength and her purpose. They would guide her breathing, encourage her to walk around if she could, and offer words of comfort. Prayer was also a central element, invoking divine assistance to protect the mother and child. The second stage of labor begins when the cervix is fully dilated, usually around 10 centimeters. This is the pushing stage, when the mother actively works to expel the baby from the womb. Contractions become incredibly powerful, each one bringing an overwhelming urge to push. The midwife would offer precise guidance, instructing the mother when to push and when to rest. This might involve squatting, sitting on a birthing stool, or lying on her side. Each position offers a different level of support and leverages gravity. Now, the pushing can be exhausting. It's a physical exertion unlike anything most of us can imagine. The mother might grunt, groan, or even scream with each contraction. The faces around her would be a mix of concern and encouragement, their voices urging her onward. With each push, the baby gradually descends through the birth canal. The midwife would be closely monitoring the baby's progress, watching for signs of distress. As the baby's head begins to emerge, this is often called crowning. The pressure is immense, and the mother might feel a burning sensation as the skin stretches. This is the point where perineal tearing, if it happens, would become inevitable. The midwife would try to support the perineum, the tissue between the vagina and anus, to minimize tearing, but sometimes it couldn't be avoided. Finally, with one last mighty push, the baby's head emerges, followed by the shoulders and the rest of the body. The midwife would quickly clear the baby's airway, ensuring that the child is breathing. She'd then carefully place the newborn onto the mother's chest. The relief must be immense, a wave of exhaustion and elation washing over her. The baby, now safely in her arms, would be cleaned and wrapped in soft cloths. The midwife would cut the umbilical cord, tying it off with a piece of linen. But the labor isn't quite over yet. The third and final stage involves the delivery of the placenta, also known as the afterbirth. Contractions continue, though less intense now, as the uterus contracts to expel the placenta. The midwife would examine the placenta to ensure that it's intact, as any retained fragments could lead to infection or hemorrhage. Once the placenta is delivered, the midwife would attend to the mother, cleaning her and tending to any tears. Suturing techniques were rudimentary, often involving coarse thread and less than ideal sanitation. Infections were a constant concern. In the hours and days that followed, the mother would need rest and nourishment to recover. Family members would tend to her needs, providing food, drink, and constant care. The midwife would continue to check on both mother and baby, monitoring for signs of infection or other complications. So that's a general overview. Of course, this is a simplified account. Things rarely go exactly as planned. Labor can be unpredictable, and complications can arise, even in the best of circumstances. But this glimpse into a 17th century birthing chamber gives us a profound appreciation for the strength and resilience of women and the dedication of the midwives who attended them. It's a journey we should remember. Alright, let's talk about what happened when things didn't go quite right during childbirth in the 17th century. Because, let's be honest, in a world without C-sections and readily available blood transfusions, a difficult birth could quickly become a life or death situation. Just try to imagine the weight of that reality. One of the scariest complications was a breech birth. Now, for those unfamiliar, a breech birth is when a baby is positioned feet or buttocks first in the womb, instead of head first. In our modern world, this is often detected well in advance, and doctors can either try to manually turn the baby, a procedure called an external cephalic version, or, if that's not possible or safe, perform a cesarean section. But back in the 1600s, those options simply didn't exist. So what were midwives to do? Well, first they would try to determine the baby's position through abdominal palpation, basically feeling the mother's belly. This required a skilled and experienced hand. If they did identify a breech presentation early in labor, they might try to gently encourage the mother to adopt certain positions, like kneeling or being on all fours, hoping gravity would help turn the baby. Some midwives were known to use external massage and gentle manipulation to coax the baby into a head-down position. The success rate, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly stellar. If the baby remained breech as labor progressed, the midwife had to rely on her skill and experience to deliver the baby vaginally, breech. Now, this was a very delicate and dangerous process. The biggest concern was that the baby's head, being the largest part of the body, could get trapped in the birth canal after the rest of the body had already emerged. This could lead to severe oxygen deprivation and sadly often resulted in stillbirth. To try and avoid this, the midwife would work carefully to guide the baby's body out, supporting the legs and buttocks. Once the torso was delivered, the midwife would try to quickly rotate the baby to help deliver the arms. This was crucial, as the arms could become extended above the head, further complicating the delivery of the head. Then came the most perilous part, delivering the head. The midwife might try to use gentle traction to pull the head down, or she might use her fingers to try and flex the baby's head, tucking the chin towards the chest. Sometimes, they employed specialized tools, blunt hooks or loops, to try and gain traction on the baby's jaw or shoulders. It was a risky maneuver, as these tools could easily injure the baby. And let's be frank, many breech births ended tragically. If the head couldn't be delivered quickly, the baby would die, and even if the baby was successfully delivered, they were often weakened or injured during the process. The mother, too, was at risk. A prolonged and difficult breech delivery could lead to exhaustion, tearing of the perineum, and postpartum hemorrhage. Breech births weren't the only emergencies midwives faced. Shoulder dystocia, where the baby's shoulder gets stuck behind the mother's pubic bone after the head has emerged, was another terrifying complication. Again, speed was of the essence. The midwife might try to reposition the mother, applying pressure to her abdomen, or reaching inside to try and manually dislodge the shoulder. There was often little more a midwife could do. Postpartum hemorrhage, or excessive bleeding after childbirth, was another leading cause of maternal death. In the 17th century, midwives had limited ways to manage this. They might try to massage the uterus to help it contract, administer herbal remedies believed to have hemostatic properties, stopping the bleeding, or apply cold compresses to the abdomen. In severe cases, they might even pack the uterus with cloths to try and stem the flow of blood. Blood transfusions were, of course, not an option. Prolapsed cord, where the umbilical cord descends into the birth canal before the baby, was yet another emergency. This could cut off the baby's oxygen supply, leading to rapid fetal distress. The midwife would try to manually elevate the baby's head to relieve pressure on the cord, while simultaneously preparing for a rapid delivery. The odds were stacked against them, and then there were cases of obstructed labor where the baby simply couldn't descend through the birth canal. This could be due to a number of factors, such as a baby being too large, the mother's pelvis being too small, or the baby being in an unfavorable position. In these situations, the midwife might try to use manual techniques to reposition the baby or widen the birth canal. Some midwives knew how to perform a procedure called a symphysiotomy, where the cartilage of the pubic symphysis is partially cut to widen the pelvis. But this was a highly risky procedure with potential for long-term complications. If all else failed and the mother's life was clearly in danger, some midwives might resort to even more drastic measures. Infanticide wasn't unheard of during situations like these, either. Craniotomy was a horrifying procedure where the baby's skull was crushed to allow for easier extraction. Let's be clear, these choices would be made as last resorts with only the intention of saving the mother's life, but the decision would need to be made very quickly with all parties consenting. Remember, the goal of the midwives was always the preservation of both the mother and the child, but it was an unfortunate period where that goal was not often reached. These were desperate measures, and they reflected the harsh realities of childbirth in a time before modern medicine. Midwives were often faced with impossible choices, forced to make life or death decisions with limited resources and knowledge. And while they undoubtedly saved countless lives, they also witnessed immense suffering and loss. It's a somber reminder of how far we've come, and a testament to the courage and skill of those who dedicated their lives to helping women through the perilous journey of childbirth. It makes you think. The 17th century, a time of grand exploration, burgeoning empires, and, tragically, heartbreaking loss. While we often celebrate the era's advancements, it's crucial to remember the stark reality faced by families welcoming new life. Today, we're gently turning our attention to a particularly somber aspect of 17th century childbirth, stillbirth, and infant mortality. Prepare yourself, because it's a difficult but essential part of understanding this historical period. Imagine the anticipation, the hopes and dreams woven around a tiny new life. Now imagine that life extinguished before it truly began. In our modern world, thanks to incredible medical advancements, stillbirth is relatively rare. But back in the 1600s, it was a tragically common occurrence. A stillbirth, defined as the death of a fetus in the womb after a certain point in pregnancy, often left families devastated and without answers. The exact causes of stillbirths were largely unknown. We can surmise that many were due to complications during labor, infections, or underlying health conditions in the mother. Conditions that today would be easily managed with proper prenatal care and intervention. But in the 17th century, the limited understanding of anatomy and physiology meant that even the most experienced midwives were often powerless to prevent such tragedies. Imagine the utter helplessness. The impact of a stillbirth extended beyond the immediate family. In many communities, a stillborn child was not afforded the same rituals or recognition as a child who had lived, even briefly. Baptism, a vital sacrament, was often denied, leaving parents grappling with spiritual as well as emotional grief. This wasn't due to malice, but rather a complex interplay of religious doctrine and the practical realities of high infant mortality. There was often a prevailing belief that baptism was necessary for salvation, and a stillborn child, never having drawn breath outside the womb, occupied a liminal space in the eyes of the Church. But if a child did survive birth, the challenges were far from over. Infant mortality rates, the number of deaths per 1,000 live births, were shockingly high. We're talking about a significant percentage of children not making it to their first birthday, let alone reaching adulthood. The statistics are staggering, often exceeding 200 or even 300 deaths per 1,000 live births in some regions. To put that in perspective, modern infant mortality rates in developed countries are typically below 5 per 1,000. So what contributed to this heartbreaking reality? A multitude of factors, all compounded by the lack of modern medicine and sanitation. Infections were a major killer. Simple illnesses that we now treat with antibiotics, things like pneumonia, dysentery, and even common colds, could quickly become fatal for infants with their still developing immune systems. Poor sanitation, contaminated water supplies, and a general lack of understanding about germ theory created breeding grounds for disease. Imagine a world without hand sanitizer, without proper sewage systems, without even a basic understanding of how germs spread. It's a terrifying thought. Nutrition also played a crucial role. While breastfeeding was the norm, not all mothers were able to produce enough milk, or the milk itself may have lacked essential nutrients. Wet nurses, women who breastfed other women's babies, were sometimes employed, but this practice was not without its own risks. The wet nurse might have been malnourished herself, or she might have carried diseases that could be transmitted to the infant. Furthermore, access to supplementary foods was limited, and many infants were weaned onto gruels or paps that were nutritionally inadequate or even contaminated. Environmental factors also played a part. Exposure to extreme temperatures, both hot and cold, could be deadly for infants. Poor housing, inadequate clothing, and a lack of heating in winter made it difficult to protect babies from the elements. Accidents, such as falls or burns, were also common, as infants were often left unattended while their parents worked. And then there were the less obvious factors, the underlying societal conditions that contributed to infant mortality. Poverty, of course, was a major driver. Impoverished families often lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions, lacked access to adequate food and clean water, and were less likely to receive even basic medical care. Social inequalities also played a role, with certain groups, such as the poor, enslaved people, and marginalized communities, experiencing even higher rates of infant mortality. The emotional toll of these high rates of infant death must have been immense. Parents lived with the constant fear of losing a child, and grief was a familiar companion. While we can't fully comprehend the emotional landscape of the 17th century, we can imagine the profound sadness, the sense of helplessness, and the constant cycle of hope and loss that permeated family life. It's a sobering reminder of how fragile life was, and how much we owe to the advancements that have made childbirth and infancy so much safer today. It's also worth noting that the high rates of infant mortality shaped societal attitudes towards children. While parents undoubtedly loved their children deeply, the ever-present threat of death may have led to a certain degree of emotional detachment, a way of protecting themselves from the inevitable pain of loss. It's also been theorized this high infant mortality contributed to the common 17th century practice of delaying naming their child, just in case the child were to pass in the first few days or weeks after being born. The names themselves also reveal a heartbreaking acceptance of reality. Benoni, meaning son of my sorrow, or Mara, meaning bitter, speak volumes about the emotional weight carried by parents of this era. The shadow of stillbirth and infant mortality loomed large over 17th century society. It was a harsh reality that shaped family life, societal attitudes, and even religious beliefs. By acknowledging this somber aspect of the past, we gain a deeper appreciation for the progress that has been made and a greater understanding of the challenges faced by those who came before us. It's a poignant reminder that even in the midst of historical progress, there often lies a heavy burden of loss and grief. Alright, let's gently settle into the topic of postpartum care back in the 17th century. Imagine, after all that labor, the real work of recovery was only just beginning. And recovery wasn't just about physical healing, it was a blend of practical care, deep-seated beliefs, and social rituals, all carefully woven together. For the new mother, the first few days, even weeks, were spent largely resting. Bed rest wasn't just a suggestion, it was practically an enforced sentence. New mothers were expected to remain in bed for a considerable period, often up to a month. This period was known as lying in, and it was considered essential for restoring the mother's strength and allowing her body to heal. Now, lying in wasn't exactly a vacation. It was a time of recuperation, but also one filled with specific practices aimed at aiding recovery. The midwife, of course, remained a key figure during this time. She would regularly check on the mother, monitoring her lochia, the discharge after childbirth, to ensure it was flowing properly and didn't show signs of infection. Herbal remedies continued to play a significant role. Warming herbs like ginger, cinnamon, and cloves were often administered in teas or broths to help purge the body and restore its natural heat, believed to have been depleted during childbirth. Cooling herbs might be used if fever presented. Lactation was also supported, with fennel seed being a popular galactagogue thought to encourage milk production. Diet was also carefully controlled. New mothers were typically given nourishing, easily digestible foods like broths, gruels, and custards. Spices were used moderately, depending on the prevailing theories about bodily humors. It was thought that the mother's diet directly influenced the quality of her breast milk, so ensuring she was well fed was paramount. One interesting practice was the use of swaddling or binding the mother's abdomen. This involved tightly wrapping the abdomen with cloths or bandages. The purpose believed that it supported and reshaped the womb, also preventing it from falling. It was supposed to aid in drawing the abdomen back to its pre-pregnancy state. It sounds rather uncomfortable to think about, doesn't it? Beyond the physical aspects, the lying-in period was also a time for social support and spiritual reflection. Female relatives and friends would often visit the new mother, offering assistance with childcare, household tasks, and emotional support. These visits were a chance to share experiences, offer advice, and celebrate the new arrival. Prayer and religious rituals were also common. Childbirth was seen as a dangerous event, and gratitude for a safe delivery was expressed through prayer and thanksgiving. Some families might have a priest visit to offer blessings for the mother and child. Now, let's turn our attention to the newborn. Care for the infant during the postpartum period was also guided by specific practices and beliefs. Immediately after birth, the baby was cleaned and swaddled tightly in linen cloths. Swaddling was believed to keep the baby warm, protect it from its own startle reflex, and encourage restful sleep. It also helped to maintain the straightness of the limbs. The baby's first bath was often delayed for a few days, possibly due to the belief that the vernix caseosa, the waxy substance covering the baby's skin at birth, had protective properties. When the bath was given, it was usually with warm water and perhaps a mild herbal infusion. Breastfeeding, of course, was the primary method of infant feeding. Mothers were encouraged to begin breastfeeding as soon as possible after birth. Colostrum, the first milk produced, was recognized as being especially beneficial for the baby's health. However, if the mother was unable to breastfeed due to illness or other reasons, a wet nurse would be employed. Newborns were also carefully monitored for signs of illness. Any unusual crying, refusal to feed, or changes in bowel movements were cause for concern. Herbal remedies were often used to treat common infant ailments like colic, constipation, or skin rashes. Rituals played a significant role in protecting the newborn from harm. Charms or amulets might be placed on the baby to ward off evil spirits or protect it from illness. Some cultures practiced specific ceremonies to welcome the baby into the world and ensure its well-being. It's all so interesting, isn't it? This mix of the practical and the spiritual. One interesting practice was the warming of the baby. Similar to the concept of warming the mother, it was believed that newborns were susceptible to cold and needed to be kept warm at all times. Babies were often kept close to the fire and wrapped in layers of clothing. Of course, in hotter months, these practices would be adjusted. The lying-in period wasn't without its challenges. Infection was a constant threat, particularly in the days before antibiotics. Puerperal fever, an infection of the reproductive tract after childbirth, was a leading cause of maternal death. Retained placenta, hemorrhage, and exhaustion were also significant risks. For the newborn, infant mortality rates were tragically high. Infections, respiratory illnesses, and congenital abnormalities claimed the lives of many infants in their first year of life. While the 17th century had its own ways of trying to combat these risks, many of them were, understandably, ineffective or even harmful. Despite the dangers and limitations, the postpartum period in the 17th century was a time of profound significance. It was a time for healing, bonding, and celebrating the miracle of new life. The rituals and practices surrounding this period reflected the beliefs and values of the time, highlighting the importance of community, spirituality, and the interconnectedness of mind, body, and spirit. It's a reminder of the resilience of women and the preciousness of new life, even in the face of hardship. All right, friends, let's gently move on and consider what happened after a baby finally arrived, safe and sound, in the 17th century. It wasn't quite time for the parents to relax, not by a long shot. One of the most crucial next steps was baptism. Now, baptism wasn't just some quaint tradition back then, it was everything. It was about welcoming a brand new tiny human, a soul, really, into the community, both earthly and, well, heavenly. Think of it as the VIP pass to, well, existence in their eyes. See, life expectancy was low, really low. Infant mortality, absolutely heartbreaking. And the prevailing belief was, if a baby died before baptism, their soul was, well, let's just say the destination wasn't desirable. Limbo was the best case scenario for many denominations, so the pressure to get that baptism done quickly was immense. We're talking days, sometimes even hours, after birth. No dilly-dallying allowed. This urgency stemmed from deeply held religious convictions. Most Europeans, and by extension many colonists, were Christian, and the specific denomination, Catholic, Anglican, Puritan, and so on, dictated exactly how they viewed baptism. But almost all of them believed it was essential for cleansing the child of original sin. Original sin, passed down from Adam and Eve, was seen as this inherent stain, this mark that needed to be washed away. Baptism was the divine scrub brush. The ceremony itself varied. Catholics, for instance, often practiced infant baptism with holy water blessed by a priest. A sprinkle here, a dab there, specific prayers recited, and poof, the baby was officially part of the church. Anglicans had their own version, also with water, usually performed by a clergyman. Puritans, now, they were a bit different. They believed in a more visible sainthood. While they did baptize infants, they saw it more as a dedication, a promise to raise the child in a God-fearing way. The real commitment, in their view, came later, when the individual made a conscious personal profession of faith. Still, the infant baptism was important. It wasn't just for the family and child, it was a public declaration of faith for the community. But baptism wasn't just about religion. It was a major social event. It was a chance for the community to come together, to celebrate a new life, and to offer support to the new parents. Think of it as the 17th century version of a baby shower, but with a much stronger spiritual undercurrent. Neighbors, friends, family. They all gathered, often at the church, or sometimes even at the home. There would be food, drink, maybe some weak ale if it was a more austere household, and of course gifts. Often these gifts were practical. Think of items for the baby, things like linen cloths, little caps, blankets, or even small sums of money to help the family get started. These gifts helped the family, but also symbolized the community's support in raising the child. And then, of course, there was the naming. The baptism was usually when the baby's name was formally announced. Names weren't just randomly chosen back then, they carried significance. There were family names passed down through generations, a way to honor ancestors. Biblical names were also hugely popular, like Mary, John, Elizabeth, all drawing on that strong religious tradition. And then you had names that reflected certain virtues or aspirations: faith, hope, charity. A little on the nose, perhaps, but you get the idea. Social status also played a role, naturally. Wealthier families might choose more elaborate, perhaps even French-inspired names, a little bit of showing off, if you will. Poorer families, they often stuck to the more traditional common names. And remember, spelling wasn't exactly standardized back then, so you might see the same name spelled multiple different ways in the records. Elizabeth might be Elizabeth, or Eliza, or even Beth. Now, godparents, they were incredibly important. The godparents weren't just honorary titles, they were active participants in the child's life. Especially in a religious sense, the number of godparents could vary depending on the denomination and local custom, but there were usually at least two, a godmother and a godfather. They were responsible for helping to raise the child in the faith, for providing moral guidance, and for stepping in if anything happened to the parents. It was a serious responsibility, and godparents were usually carefully chosen from among close family or trusted friends. If the parents died, the responsibility for the child's care often fell to the godparents. So baptism, in the 17th century, was so much more than just a religious ritual. It was a social declaration, a community celebration, a naming ceremony, and the formal establishment of a support system for the child. It was about ensuring the baby's spiritual well-being, about welcoming them into the community, and about providing them with the best possible start in a world that was, let's face it, often pretty harsh. And it set the stage for, well, everything that came next. The child's identity, their place in the family, their connection to the community. It all flowed from that initial crucial act of baptism. All right, settle in, let's talk about something kinda interesting. Wet nurses. In the 17th century, breastfeeding wasn't always straightforward. For many women, for a whole host of reasons, they just couldn't or wouldn't breastfeed their own child, and that's where wet nurses came in. A wet nurse, simply put, was a woman who breastfed another woman's baby. Think of her as a surrogate provider, I guess. It was a pretty common practice across Europe, especially among the wealthier classes. Now, why would someone choose a wet nurse? Well, there were loads of reasons. For starters, some women genuinely couldn't breastfeed. Maybe they had health issues, or maybe, tragically, they died during childbirth. Some women struggled to produce enough milk. Childbirth is difficult enough, and some people's bodies don't always cooperate afterwards. Then, there were social reasons. Upper-class women, in particular, might see breastfeeding as, well, a bit beneath them. They wanted to get back to their social lives, their duties, their husbands. Breastfeeding, tethers you, restricts you. Having a wet nurse gave them that freedom, and it wasn't just about convenience either. Some believed that breastfeeding could affect a woman's beauty, that it would drain their vitality, make them less attractive to their husbands. Kinda sad, really. the pressures they were under. It was also thought that breastfeeding made you less likely to conceive, and the goal was often to have as many children as possible. So who were these wet nurses? They were usually women from the working classes, often recent mothers themselves. They'd lost their own baby, or maybe their husband couldn't provide enough, and nursing someone else's child was a way to earn a living. It was a job, plain and simple. But, and this is a big but, it came with a whole heap of social implications. Think about it. You're handing over your newborn, the most precious thing in your life, to a complete stranger. You're trusting her to nourish and care for your child. That trust, that connection, it wasn't taken lightly. There was this anxiety, this fear that the wet nurse's character, her very essence, would somehow be transferred to the baby through her milk. People really believed this. They thought a wet nurse's morals, her temperament, her health, it would all seep into the child. So choosing a wet nurse wasn't just about finding someone who produced good milk. It was about finding someone of good character. Mothers would, if they could, look for nurses of sound mind and body. You wanted someone healthy, someone upstanding, someone virtuous. This led to all sorts of social anxieties and judgments. Wealthy families would often investigate potential wet nurses, looking into their backgrounds, their families, their reputations. It was like a background check, centuries before those were even a thing. People feared that if the wet nurse was immoral or of a certain class, the baby would be too. And what about the wet nurse's own child? Well, that's where things get even trickier. If she was still breastfeeding her own baby, she'd have to wean them early to take on the new charge. This could be devastating for the wet nurse's own child, depriving them of vital nourishment, potentially leading to illness or even death. There were stories of wet nurses prioritizing the wealthy baby over their own, and that's terrible to imagine. It really highlights the inequality of the time. The wealthy could afford to give their children the best possible start in life, while the poor often had to sacrifice their own children's well-being just to survive. You can imagine the inner turmoil this caused, the moral compromises that some of these women had to make. There was also this whole power dynamic at play. The wet nurse was essentially employed by the family, subject to their rules and whims. She was often brought into the household, living there for months or even years, completely dependent on the family's generosity. She could be dismissed at any time, leaving her without income and possibly without a home. And then there was the issue of affection. Did the wet nurse develop a bond with the baby she was nursing? Did the baby see her as a mother figure? What was the impact on the real mother? It's all a bit complicated. You know, some upper-class women would maintain a distance from their children, leaving the wet nurse to handle most of the day-to-day care, and others would worry about becoming replaced. They might feel a pang of jealousy, a fear of losing that special connection. All this, all the anxieties and implications, really shows you how central breastfeeding was and wasn't to motherhood in the 17th century. It was this essential act, the very source of life. But it was also tied up with social status, with power, with all sorts of complex emotions. It's easy to look back and judge, but it's important to remember the context. The options were often limited, the pressures were immense, and everyone was just trying to do what they thought was best, even when best came at a high cost. It's kind of a somber topic actually, but it's also really fascinating. The practice of wet nursing was much more than just childcare. It was deeply embedded in the society, economics and beliefs of the time, and it serves as a stark reminder of the stark inequalities and impossible choices that many women faced. Multiple births. Even the name sounds overwhelming, doesn't it? Imagine being an expectant mother in the 17th century and discovering you weren't just carrying one babe, but two, or even gasp, three. It's like suddenly finding out your quiet little teacup ride at the fair is actually a roaring roller coaster. In our modern world, with ultrasounds and fertility treatments, we're quite familiar with the prospect of twins, triplets, and even more. But back then, no such warning system existed. A woman simply grew larger, perhaps experienced more intense morning sickness, and midwives might, with skilled hands, suspect something unusual. The actual confirmation, however, would only come during the delivery itself. Can you imagine the sheer surprise and perhaps a little terror of pushing out one child, only to realize there's another one coming? It's like ordering a single scoop of ice cream and getting a whole sundae bar. Now, for the average family, just surviving with one child was already a challenge. Infant mortality rates were incredibly high, remember? So the prospect of suddenly having to provide for 2 or 3 infants, well, it could be incredibly daunting. Resources were stretched thin, extra sets of clothing, more food, and finding enough time to care for each individual child became a monumental task. Socially, multiple births were viewed with a mixture of awe, suspicion, and sometimes even downright fear. On one hand, twins especially could be seen as a sign of God's favor, a double blessing upon the family. It was almost like winning a small, slightly sticky lottery. On the other hand, darker beliefs sometimes surfaced, particularly in more superstitious communities. Think about it from their point of view. They didn't understand genetics or the science of conception. Multiple births were unusual, and anything unusual often bred mistrust. Some whispered that twins were the result of the woman having relations with 2 different men. A rather scandalous claim indeed, and one that could bring shame and suspicion upon the mother and her family, or worse. In some cultures, twins were even associated with the supernatural or the demonic. This belief, thankfully, wasn't universally held, but it was a lurking fear nonetheless. Can you imagine the societal pressure and the fear of judgment? But let's focus on the practical challenges. Midwives, bless their experienced hands, were the primary caregivers during these multiple births. They relied on their intuition, their knowledge of birthing positions, and whatever herbal remedies they knew to aid the delivery. However, they had no way to know the position of the 2nd or 3rd child, or if there might be complications like a prolapsed cord or the babies being tangled together. Each subsequent birth carried a greater risk of postpartum hemorrhage for the mother. The uterus, already exhausted from delivering the first child, might struggle to contract properly, leading to potentially life-threatening bleeding. It was like trying to squeeze water out of a sponge that's already completely dry, and the babies themselves faced an uphill battle. Prematurity was common in multiple births, and without incubators or even a proper understanding of neonatal care, premature infants had very little chance of survival. They were often smaller, weaker, and more susceptible to infections. It was a cruel reality. Breastfeeding, of course, was essential, but also incredibly demanding. Imagine trying to nourish 2 or 3 babies simultaneously. Wet nurses, women who breastfed other women's children, might be employed if the mother was unable to produce enough milk, or if she was simply too weak to manage the demand. However, finding a reliable and healthy wet nurse could be difficult, and it was an expensive option, placing even more strain on the family. Beyond the physical strain, the psychological impact on the mother must have been enormous. The constant demands of caring for multiple infants, coupled with the fear of their survival and the societal pressures we discussed, it's no wonder many women struggled with postpartum depression, although of course they wouldn't have had a name for it back then. It's a wonder they found the energy to get out of bed sometimes. Despite all these challenges, stories of successful multiple births do exist. These families, against all odds, managed to raise their twins or triplets, often with the help of extended family and the community. These children, having survived those perilous early years, often formed incredibly strong bonds with each other, a unique connection forged in the face of adversity. It's like they had their own secret language, their own shared history from the very beginning. So next time you see a set of twins or triplets, take a moment to appreciate not only the joy and wonder they represent, but also the incredible challenges that multiple births presented in the 17th century. It was a testament to the resilience of mothers, the skills of midwives, and perhaps just a little bit of luck. A reminder of how far we've come, and the silent battles fought, and sometimes lost, to bring new life into the world. And perhaps a reminder to be just a little bit more grateful for the modern marvels that make the journey just a bit safer and a little less terrifying. Okay, let's settle in and consider how wealth, or the lack thereof, dramatically altered a woman's childbirth experience in the 17th century. It's a stark contrast, painting two very different pictures of a shared human experience. For women of noble birth, or those from affluent merchant families, pregnancy and childbirth, while still risky, were approached with a level of comfort and care simply unimaginable for the poor. Think spacious, well-heated chambers, servants attending to every need, and access to the best midwives, physicians, and supplies available at the time. Wealthy women often had a dedicated birthing chamber, prepared well in advance of the due date. These weren't cold, sterile rooms. They were often richly decorated, reflecting the family's status and providing a sense of comfort and security. Tapestries adorned the walls, warming the space and providing visual distractions during labor. Soft, luxurious linens covered the birthing bed, offering a level of comfort that would have been a distant dream for a peasant woman. And imagine the sheer manpower available. Several female servants would be on hand, catering to the mother's every whim, fetching drinks, preparing food, and offering emotional support. A skilled cook would ensure nourishing meals were readily available, recognizing the importance of strength and sustenance during the physically demanding process of labor. This team approach wasn't just about comfort, it was about having immediate access to assistance in case of complications. Now, let's talk about the medical professionals. Wealthy families could afford to hire not only experienced midwives, but also university-trained physicians, often men who were starting to play a more prominent, albeit controversial, role in childbirth among the elite. While midwives remained the primary caregivers, the presence of a physician provided a sense of security, particularly in complicated cases. They would be consulted if the labor was long, or if it was felt something was amiss. Furthermore, wealthy women had access to a wider range of herbal remedies and specialized provisions. Apothecaries could be summoned to prepare specific concoctions believed to ease labor pains, promote milk production, or aid in postpartum recovery. They had access to warming spices, soothing oils, and strengthening broths that poor women could simply not afford. Think imported cinnamon to warm the body, or exotic sugars to make drinks more palatable. Even something as simple as clean linens became a significant advantage. With multiple sets of sheets and cloths, the birthing chamber could be kept as hygienic as possible, reducing the risk of infection, which was a major killer during childbirth. Postpartum, wealthy women could afford to rest for extended periods, often weeks, allowing their bodies to fully recover, attended to by servants who shielded them from the demands of daily life. In stark contrast, consider the experience of a poor woman. For her, childbirth was often a brutal and lonely ordeal. Pregnancy itself might have been viewed as an additional burden, adding to an already strained existence. She might be required to work in the fields or perform demanding household tasks right up until the onset of labor, often malnourished and exhausted. The birthing environment for a poor woman was usually her own meager dwelling, perhaps a single room shared with other family members. There was no dedicated birthing chamber, no tapestries, no soft linens. The birth might take place on a straw pallet on the floor, or on a roughly made bed, likely infested with fleas and other vermin. Forget dedicated servants. A poor woman would rely on the help of female relatives or neighbors, women who themselves were likely burdened with their own hardships. These women would offer what support they could, but their knowledge was often limited, based on folklore and passed down traditions rather than formal training. They could do what they could, but their knowledge of how to treat things was limited. Access to midwives was also significantly limited for the poor. While most villages had a local midwife, her services weren't free, and poor families might struggle to afford them. In some cases, a woman might have to give birth without any professional assistance whatsoever, relying solely on the help of untrained relatives. Medical intervention was practically non-existent for poor women. Physicians were far beyond their reach, and even basic herbal remedies were often unaffordable. They might rely on plants gathered from the surrounding countryside, but their knowledge of these plants and their proper usage could be incomplete or even dangerous. Hygiene was a constant challenge. Clean water was scarce, and the lack of clean linens significantly increased the risk of infection. Postpartum care was practically non-existent. A poor woman would often have to resume her daily chores shortly after giving birth, leaving her vulnerable to complications and hindering her recovery. She might return to the fields within days of the birth, out of necessity. The differences extended beyond the physical aspects of childbirth. Wealthy women enjoyed social support and recognition during their pregnancies, while poor women often faced stigma and discrimination, especially if they were unmarried. The birth of a healthy heir was a cause for celebration in wealthy families, reinforcing their social standing. For poor families, another mouth to feed could be seen as a financial burden, adding to their already precarious existence. Furthermore, infant mortality rates were significantly higher among the poor. Malnutrition, lack of access to medical care, and unhygienic living conditions contributed to a higher risk of infant death in the first few months of life. The constant threat of death during childbirth was a stark reality for all women in the 17th century, but it was particularly acute for those living in poverty. It's easy to forget how much the simple absence of sanitation and good nutrition can change things. So to summarize, while childbirth was a universal experience in the 17th century, the realities were profoundly shaped by social class. Wealth offered a degree of comfort, care, and access to medical expertise that could significantly improve a woman's chances of survival and a baby's chances of thriving. Poverty, on the other hand, meant facing childbirth alone, with limited resources and a significantly increased risk of death and suffering. The contrast is a sobering reminder of the vast inequalities that existed in the 17th century and how those inequalities impacted even the most fundamental of human experiences. It's quite a contrast. Alright, let's drift into the role of faith in 17th century childbirth. It's a world where God's hand is seen in absolutely everything, and pregnancy is no exception. Imagine a time before we really understood biology, where the mysteries of conception and the growth of a baby felt, well, miraculous. For many, pregnancy wasn't just a physical event, it was a divinely orchestrated process. God was seen as the ultimate creator, the one who breathed life into the womb. This belief shaped everything from how women viewed their bodies to the rituals surrounding birth. It was a very heavy responsibility, and very little of it was on firm ground in the way we see things today. The Bible played a huge role, of course. Certain passages were interpreted as offering guidance or explanations for the pain and dangers of childbirth. Think about the story of Eve and the curse in Genesis. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children. It was often seen as a direct explanation for the pain women experienced in labor. It wasn't just bad luck, it was a consequence of sin, a burden women had to bear. This idea could unfortunately lead to feelings of guilt or shame for some women, especially if they struggled to conceive or had difficult pregnancies. They might see it as a sign of God's displeasure, a punishment for their own or their ancestors' sins. It's a sobering thought that the natural processes of the body could be so closely tied to moral judgments. But faith also offered tremendous comfort and hope. Pregnancy was seen as a blessing, a sign of God's favor. Prayers were a constant companion for expectant mothers. They prayed for a healthy pregnancy, a safe delivery, and a strong, healthy child. These weren't just quick whispers, they were deep, heartfelt pleas woven into daily life. Religious rituals were also very important. Special church services might be held for pregnant women, asking for divine protection. Midwives, who were often deeply religious women themselves, would frequently incorporate prayers and blessings into their care. They saw themselves as instruments of God's will, helping to bring new life into the world under His watchful eye. Think of the act of baptism, often performed very soon after birth. It wasn't just a formality, it was a crucial step to cleanse the newborn of original sin and welcome them into the Christian community. Infant mortality was tragically high, so baptism felt particularly urgent, a way to ensure the child's soul was safe in the event of death. Imagine the grief, compounded by the fear of an unbaptized child passing. And what about those complications? A difficult labor, a breech birth, or the death of a child were often interpreted as signs of God testing a person's faith. It was a time to turn to prayer, to seek forgiveness, and to trust in God's plan, even when it was impossible to understand. This wasn't always a comfort, of course. It could also lead to intense feelings of despair and questioning. Why me? Must have been a frequent cry in the birthing chambers of the time. Superstitions were deeply intertwined with religious beliefs. Many believed that certain objects or actions could ward off evil spirits and protect the mother and child. Amulets with religious symbols might be worn, or specific prayers recited during labor. These weren't seen as contradicting faith, but rather as complementary ways to seek divine protection. It was like having all bases covered, both spiritual and practical, in a world full of unknowns. Even the social support network for pregnant women was often rooted in religious communities. Neighbors and fellow church members would offer practical help, emotional support, and of course, constant prayer. It was a collective effort, a shared responsibility to care for those in need, reflecting the Christian values of charity and compassion. This sense of community was invaluable in a time when resources were limited and life was fragile. Knowing you were not alone, that you had the support of your neighbors and your church, must have been a tremendous comfort. Attitudes toward midwives themselves were often shaped by religious beliefs. While respected for their skills and experience, they were also seen as moral figures, entrusted with a sacred task. Their role wasn't just about delivering babies, it was about upholding religious values and ensuring the well-being of the community. This added a layer of responsibility to their work, making them both caregivers and spiritual guides. Imagine the pressure of holding not just a life in your hands, but also the spiritual well-being of the mother and child. However, it's important to remember that religious beliefs weren't always a source of comfort and support. They could also be used to justify harmful practices or reinforce existing social inequalities. Some religious teachings, for example, emphasized female submission and obedience, potentially silencing women's voices and limiting their autonomy during pregnancy and childbirth. And beliefs about sin and punishment could lead to blaming women for complications or even accusing them of witchcraft if something went wrong. It's a stark reminder that even the most deeply held beliefs can be twisted and used to cause harm. So as we reflect on childbirth in the 17th century, it's crucial to understand the profound influence of religious beliefs. They shaped attitudes towards pregnancy, influenced medical practices, and offered both comfort and potential for harm. It was a world where God was seen as intimately involved in every aspect of life, and childbirth was no exception. To truly understand the experience of women in this era, we must acknowledge the powerful role of faith in their lives, both the solace and the shadows it cast upon the birthing chamber. Alright, let's ease into how childbirth adapted to the colonies, shall we? Imagine leaving behind everything familiar, the comforting rituals, the familiar faces, even the very herbs your midwife knew so well. Now plop that expectant mama down in a brand new land, colonial America. It's the 17th century, and things are about to get, well, different. One of the biggest hurdles was simply access. Back in Europe, even a small village usually had a midwife. But in the colonies, settlements were scattered, distances were vast, and getting from one place to another could take days, even weeks. Think muddy tracks instead of roads, dense forests, and the ever-present risk of, well, everything from wild animals to less than friendly encounters. So if a woman went into labor unexpectedly, or if complications arose, getting help wasn't as simple as sending for the midwife down the lane. Sometimes it was a frantic race against time, across miles of unforgiving terrain. This isolation also meant relying more heavily on family and neighbors. Women formed tight-knit communities, sharing knowledge and offering support during pregnancy and childbirth. If the midwife couldn't reach you, it was your female relatives, your close friends, who stepped in. They pooled their collective wisdom, the herbal remedies they remembered from their mothers, the birthing techniques they'd witnessed, the prayers and rituals that offered comfort. It wasn't always ideal, but it was what they had. And speaking of herbal remedies, let's talk about adaptation. The flora of North America was vastly different from that of Europe. The familiar herbs that midwives relied on, the ones for easing labor pains, for stopping bleeding, for promoting milk production, weren't always available, so colonists had to experiment. They learned from Native Americans, observing which plants were used for medicinal purposes. They tried different combinations, testing and refining their knowledge through trial and error. Think of it as a botanical treasure hunt. They might have found that a local plant, like black cohosh, offered similar benefits to something they were used to in Europe. Or they discovered entirely new remedies, plants with properties they'd never encountered before. But this process was slow and it was risky. Not every plant was safe, and misidentification could have dire consequences. Another challenge was the sheer hardship of colonial life. These women weren't just pregnant, they were also working. They were tending gardens, raising livestock, cooking meals over open fires, spinning thread, weaving cloth. The list goes on and on. Life in the colonies was physically demanding, and pregnancy didn't offer much of a reprieve. This constant exertion could lead to exhaustion, premature labor, and other complications. And then there was the food. While some colonists thrived, others struggled to maintain a healthy diet. Fresh fruits and vegetables could be scarce, especially during the winter months. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, was a real threat, not just to sailors, but to pregnant women as well. Malnutrition weakened their bodies, making them more susceptible to infections and complications during childbirth. Housing also played a role. Colonial homes, especially in the early years, were often small, cramped, and poorly ventilated. This created a breeding ground for disease. Poor sanitation, lack of clean water, and infestations of vermin all contributed to a higher risk of infection, both for the mother and the newborn. But perhaps the most significant adaptation was a shift in cultural attitudes. In Europe, childbirth was seen as primarily a woman's domain. Men were generally excluded from the birthing chamber. But in the colonies, with fewer midwives and greater reliance on family, men sometimes played a more active role. Husbands might assist with practical tasks, offering emotional support, or even helping with the delivery itself if no other help was available. This wasn't always a welcome change. Some women resented the intrusion of men into what they considered a sacred space, but necessity often trumped tradition. In the colonies, survival depended on everyone pitching in, regardless of gender. And let's not forget the ever-present fear. Infant mortality rates were high, and women knew that childbirth was a risky undertaking. They prayed for a safe delivery. They followed superstitions. They clung to their faith, anything to ward off the dangers that lurked around every corner. They also adapted their beliefs. Existing European beliefs about sin and the fallen state of women, because of Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden, were heavily enforced as justification for the incredible amount of pain and suffering encountered during childbirth. It's not to say they were any less religious in Europe, but the extreme circumstances of the New World gave the additional justification for these ideas to be so heavily and strictly enforced. All of this, the isolation, the lack of resources, the demanding labor, the changing roles, the ever-present fear, shaped the experience of childbirth in colonial America. It was a testament to the resilience and adaptability of these women, who faced extraordinary challenges with courage and determination. They adapted European practices to a new world, creating a unique blend of tradition, innovation, and sheer grit. Their stories remind us of the strength and resourcefulness of the human spirit and the enduring power of community in the face of adversity. It's a legacy that continues to resonate today, in the way we approach childbirth and in the way we value the bonds of family and friendship. So next time you think about colonial life, remember those women, laboring in their small homes, surrounded by their loved ones, bringing new life into a challenging world. They were the unsung heroes of the American frontier, and their stories deserve to be told. Alright, let's nestle in and consider a rather isolating aspect of 17th century childbirth: life in the rural communities. Imagine, if you will, not being nestled in a bustling town, close to neighbors, and maybe even a skilled doctor. Instead, picture yourself miles, sometimes days, away from the nearest settlement, surrounded by fields, forests, and the vast, often unforgiving countryside. In these remote settings, the challenges of childbirth amplified tenfold. First and foremost was the simple, stark reality of isolation. When labor began, there was no quick carriage ride to a midwife, no frantic messenger sent to fetch the physician. Instead, the expectant mother and her family were often entirely reliant on themselves or, at best, a neighboring woman with some experience, but perhaps little formal training. The sheer distance to assistance could be terrifying. Travel in the 17th century was slow, arduous, and weather-dependent. A sudden storm could render roads impassable, turning a manageable journey into a life-threatening ordeal. Think of a community where the nearest skilled individual is a day away. A day in a horse-drawn cart, in a time when hours mattered between life and death. Now, consider the limited resources available in these rural areas. While even wealthier households relied on home births, they had the advantage of being able to stockpile supplies and potentially call upon specialists. In rural communities, resources were often scarce. Herbal remedies, passed down through generations, might be the only form of pain relief available. Simple necessities, like clean linens and hot water, could be in short supply, especially during the winter months when freezing temperatures made even basic tasks a struggle. The birthing chamber, typically a room in the family home, would likely be sparsely furnished. Forget the specialized equipment we have today. A simple bed, perhaps a sturdy chair, and a collection of well-worn blankets were the extent of the preparations. Sterility, as we understand it, was not a concept. Cleanliness was valued, but the understanding of germs and infection was limited. This meant that the risk of postpartum infections, such as childbed fever, was significantly higher in these rural settings. Furthermore, access to nutritious food was often a challenge. A healthy diet is crucial during pregnancy and postpartum recovery, but rural communities often faced food shortages, particularly during the winter. Preserved meats, root vegetables, and grains formed the bulk of the diet, lacking the vital vitamins and minerals needed for optimal health. This nutritional deficiency weakened both the mother and the child, making them more susceptible to illness. Consider, too, the mental toll of this isolation. Pregnancy and childbirth can be emotionally challenging even under the best of circumstances. In rural communities, the lack of social support and the constant worry about potential complications could be incredibly stressful. The expectant mother might feel utterly alone, burdened by the weight of her responsibility and the fear of the unknown. Superstitions and folklore often played a significant role in rural childbirth practices. In the absence of scientific understanding, people turned to traditional beliefs and rituals to protect themselves and their babies. babies. These beliefs could range from harmless customs like wearing specific amulets to potentially harmful practices like delaying medical intervention in favor of superstitious remedies. While folklore provided a sense of comfort and control, it could also hinder access to effective care. Think about the knowledge base in these communities. While midwives, even those with limited training, possessed valuable experience, their understanding of anatomy and physiology was often rudimentary. They relied on intuition, observation, and passed down wisdom, rather than scientific knowledge. This meant that they might be unable to recognize or effectively manage certain complications, such as breech births or postpartum hemorrhage. Compounding all of this was the simple harshness of rural life. Women in these communities were often engaged in physically demanding labor throughout their pregnancies. They worked in the fields, tended to livestock, and performed countless household chores, often with little rest or support. This physical exertion increased the risk of complications during pregnancy and childbirth. Now imagine a prolonged labor, stretching on for days, far from any assistance. The mother exhausted, dehydrated, and in excruciating pain. The midwife or neighboring woman doing her best with limited knowledge and resources. The family anxiously waiting, their hope dwindling with each passing hour. This was the reality for many women in 17th century rural communities. When complications did arise, the options were severely limited. A breech birth, for example, could be a death sentence for both mother and child. The midwife might attempt to turn the baby, but without proper training or equipment, the procedure was often unsuccessful and could cause further injury. Postpartum hemorrhage, another life-threatening complication, was particularly difficult to manage in rural settings. Without access to blood transfusions or specialized medications, the midwife could only rely on basic techniques such as uterine massage and herbal remedies, which were often insufficient to stop the bleeding. Even after a successful birth, the challenges continued. Infant mortality rates were alarmingly high, particularly in rural communities, where access to clean water and nutritious food was limited. Simple infections such as diarrhea or respiratory illnesses could quickly become fatal. The loss of a child was a common occurrence, a tragic reality that shaped the lives of many rural families. The contrast with childbirth in wealthier, more urban settings is stark. While even privileged women faced risks, they had access to better resources, skilled medical practitioners, and a supportive social network. Rural women, on the other hand, were often left to face the challenges of childbirth alone, in a world where isolation and limited resources could mean the difference between life and death. It's a somber but necessary piece to the puzzle of 17th century childbirth. It underscores the profound inequalities that existed and the extraordinary resilience of women who navigated these perilous circumstances. It's a quiet testament to the strength and determination needed to bring new life into a world that at times seemed determined to resist it. All right, let's settle in and talk about the dads of the 17th century. You might be surprised, or maybe not, by just how much, or how little, they were involved in the whole pregnancy and childbirth experience. Now let's preface this by saying that the father's role could vary quite a bit depending on his social class, his personal beliefs, and even the geographical location. But there were certainly some overarching themes. Generally speaking, fathers in the 17th century were not nearly as involved in the day-to-day aspects of pregnancy and childbirth as we often see today. It wasn't necessarily because they didn't care, it was more a reflection of the social norms and expectations of the time. Think of it as a different division of labor, shall we say. The expectant mother was very much considered to be within the women's sphere. Pregnancy and childbirth were seen as inherently female experiences, best managed by women, mothers, sisters, friends, and of course midwives. Men were often kept at arm's length, perhaps out of a sense of delicacy, or maybe even superstitious fear. Childbirth could be a dangerous thing, and perhaps they thought their presence might jinx things. However, that doesn't mean fathers were completely absent, far from it. Their primary role was that of provider and protector. A father was expected to ensure his wife had adequate food, shelter, and clothing during her pregnancy. He was responsible for the economic well-being of the family, which became even more crucial with a new baby on the way. So he'd be out there, working hard, tilling the fields, or whatever his trade may be, to keep the family afloat. He was also expected to protect his wife from physical harm. This could mean anything from defending the home against intruders to ensuring she wasn't overworked or exposed to dangerous conditions. Now, what that looked like in practice varied. Some men were incredibly attentive and supportive, while others, well, let's just say they fell short of the ideal. Emotionally, the father's role was a bit more nuanced. Displays of overt emotion, especially by men, were generally frowned upon in the 17th century. So while a father might have been deeply concerned about his wife's well-being, he might not have expressed it in the way we'd expect today. Think less, holding her hand and whispering encouraging words during labor, and more, pacing anxiously in another room, maybe offering a stiff drink to the midwife. That's not to say there wasn't affection. Many letters and diaries from the period reveal deep love and concern between husbands and wives, but it was often expressed through actions rather than words. A father might show his love by ensuring his wife had the best possible care, by taking on extra chores to ease her burden, or simply by being a steady and reliable presence in her life. When it came to the actual birth, the father's role was even more limited. In many cases, he wasn't even present in the birthing chamber. Childbirth was considered a private, female affair. The mother would be surrounded by her female friends and relatives, and of course the midwife. The father might be nearby, waiting anxiously for news, but he wouldn't typically be involved in the delivery itself. There were exceptions, of course. In some cases, particularly among the lower classes, the father might be present to offer physical support. He might hold his wife's hand, wipe her brow, or simply offer a comforting presence. But even then, he would generally defer to the women in charge, the midwife and the other female attendants. Why this distance? This separation? Well, a few reasons. Firstly, there was the belief that childbirth was inherently dangerous, and a man's presence might somehow interfere with the natural process. Secondly, there was a certain level of squeamishness. Childbirth could be a messy and, well, graphic affair, and it wasn't considered appropriate for men to witness it. And thirdly, there was the ever-present influence of religious beliefs. Some believed that childbirth was a punishment for Eve's sin, and therefore a uniquely female burden. However, once the baby was born, the father's role shifted. He was now responsible for officially acknowledging the child as his own. This was usually done through a formal christening ceremony, where the baby would be given a name and welcomed into the community. The father would typically be present at the christening, along with the godparents, and he would publicly declare his paternity. This act of acknowledgement was incredibly important, both legally and socially. It established the child's legitimacy, ensuring they had inheritance rights and a place within the family. It also solidified the father's responsibility for the child's upbringing and welfare. After the christening, the father would typically take a more active role in the child's life. He would be responsible for providing for their material needs and for teaching them the skills and values they would need to succeed in life. He would also be responsible for their religious education, ensuring they were raised in accordance with the family's beliefs. But even in these later stages of childcare, the mother remained the primary caregiver. She would be responsible for the child's day-to-day needs, for nurturing them, and for instilling in them the basic values of the family. The father's role was more that of a distant authority figure, someone to be respected and obeyed, but not necessarily someone to be cuddled and confided in. Of course, all of this is a generalization. There were plenty of fathers who defied these social norms, who were deeply involved in every aspect of their children's lives. But, by and large, the father's role in the 17th century was more that of provider and protector than that of active caregiver. One other interesting element to consider is the legal standing of the father. He held almost complete authority over his children and his wife. He could legally punish them, arrange their marriages, and control their inheritance. While not all fathers were tyrannical, this legal power dynamic certainly shaped the relationship between fathers and their families. So to sum it up, the 17th century father was a complex figure. He might not have been as involved in the nitty-gritty details of pregnancy and childbirth as we are today, but he played a crucial role in providing for his family and ensuring their well-being. He was a figure of authority, a protector, and a provider. And while his emotional expressions might have been more restrained than we're used to, his love for his family was often just as deep. And hopefully that clears that up for now. Alright, let's settle in and have a little chat about what folks back in the 17th century actually knew about how babies were made and born. It's a bit of a journey because their understanding was, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly up to par with what we learn in, say, middle school biology. So medical texts, the big names of the time weren't exactly cutting-edge researchers. We're talking about relying on figures like Galen, a Greek physician from the 2nd century AD. His ideas, though influential for centuries, were outdated, to put it mildly. Think of it like trying to navigate with a map that's 1,000 years old. Charming perhaps, but not terribly practical. Galen's theories revolved heavily around the concept of humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The idea was that these fluids needed to be in perfect balance for good health. Pregnancy, that was just another state of imbalance. To him, the female body was basically an imperfect version of the male body, cooler and less able to cook things properly. This led to some rather interesting explanations for everything. For instance, menstruation was seen as the body's way of purging excess blood, which women were thought to produce in greater quantities than men. The womb itself was described as wandering around the body if it wasn't kept in place by regular sexual activity or pregnancy. I know, right. And as for conception, the prevailing theory was that both men and women produced seed, and that these seeds mixed together in the womb to create a new life. There was some understanding that the male seed or sperm was important, but the exact mechanism was completely unknown. Now, let's talk about anatomy. Dissection was tricky. The church had some pretty strong feelings about it. So actual hands-on experience with human bodies was relatively rare compared to today. Most anatomical knowledge came from dissecting animals, mostly pigs and primates, which weren't quite the same thing. This meant that depictions of the female reproductive system were often imaginative, to say the least. You'd see illustrations showing multiple chambers in the uterus, or bizarrely shaped ovaries that looked more like testicles. One popular theory, stemming from Aristotle, was that the uterus had 7 chambers, one for each potential child in a litter. While some medical practitioners started challenging these ideas, they were slow to gain traction. There were, of course, some exceptions. Surgeons like Ambroise Paré in France were starting to push for more direct observation and practical experience. He wasn't specifically a childbirth expert, but his emphasis on careful observation and experimentation influenced medical practice more broadly. He questioned many of Galen's teachings, advocating for new approaches to surgery, but even Paré's understanding was limited. The true role of the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, and the process of fertilization remained shrouded in mystery. They simply lacked the tools, the microscopes, the chemical analyses, the understanding of cellular biology to really grasp what was going on inside the female body. It's also really important to keep in mind that medical knowledge wasn't exactly widespread. Books were expensive and typically written in Latin, which immediately limited access to the educated elite. Most people relied on the knowledge passed down through families or the local midwife, who we'll get to, often had a wealth of practical experience, but not necessarily a deep understanding of anatomy. The printing press was becoming more widespread, so new ideas were starting to circulate more easily. Anatomical atlases, like those by Andreas Vesalius, which featured incredibly detailed illustrations of the human body based on actual dissections, were becoming more common. However, even these groundbreaking works often perpetuated some of the older theories about reproduction. Vesalius still subscribed to the idea of female seed and the wandering womb, even while revolutionizing other areas of anatomy. Obstetrics as a specialized field was really only beginning to emerge during this time. Before the 17th century, surgery was kind of one big generalized field. There weren't really specialists the way we understand them today. So gradually some surgeons did decide to focus particularly on childbirth, but there was no formalized training or certification process. Their knowledge was often a mix of surgical skill, anatomical theory, and practical experience gained through assisting in deliveries. One figure that's worth knowing about is William Harvey. Now, most people know him for his work on the circulation of blood, but he also spent a lot of time studying the reproduction of animals, particularly deer. He meticulously dissected deer uteruses at various stages of pregnancy to try to understand how the embryo developed. Harvey disproved some long-held Aristotelian ideas about how life was created, but he couldn't quite figure out what the sperm and egg did together. He knew sperm had to get into the uterus, but he didn't understand how the sperm caused development. His work De Generatione Animalium was groundbreaking. Ultimately, the state of scientific knowledge in the 17th century regarding reproduction was a fascinating and somewhat frustrating mix of ancient theories, emerging observations, and sheer guesswork. They were starting to move beyond the old rigid explanations, but they were still very much in the dark about the fundamental processes of life. They were like explorers charting unknown territory with limited tools and a lot of faith. It's a slow, somewhat meandering path toward understanding, and it's something to keep in mind when we're looking at what childbirth was like then, because what they thought was happening informed every aspect of the experience. Okay, so let's gently ease into the late 17th century, shall we? Picture a world where the foundations of childbirth practices are shifting. It's a subtle change, a gradual dawn rather than a sudden sunrise, but it's there. For centuries, midwives were childbirth. They held the knowledge, the experience, and the trust of the community. But slowly, ever so slowly, male doctors, or man midwives, as they were sometimes called, begin to inch their way into this very female space. Now, why this shift? Well, a few things are happening simultaneously. One key factor is the rise of scientific rationalism. The Enlightenment is beginning to cast its light, and with it comes a growing emphasis on observation, anatomy, and what was perceived as objective knowledge. Medicine, as a whole, is starting to professionalize, and universities mostly dominated by men are increasingly seen as the arbiters of legitimate medical expertise. Think of it like this. For a long time, understanding the body was based on a mixture of traditional knowledge, herbalism, and theories inherited from the ancient Greeks. Now, though, dissection is becoming more common. Anatomical texts are being published with increasingly accurate illustrations, and folks are beginning to feel like we are truly understanding how all the bits fit together. This growing scientific curiosity, it also extended to childbirth. And of course, with increased anatomical understanding, people are starting to come up with shiny new tools. The most infamous of these has to be the obstetrical forceps. Invented in the early 17th century by the Chamberlain family in England, these, well, they look terrifying, to be honest. They were essentially large metal tongs designed to grasp the baby's head and help pull it out during a difficult labor. The Chamberlains, very shrewdly, kept their invention secret for decades, using it to build a lucrative practice amongst the wealthy. For a long time, they were the only ones performing this newfangled procedure. Now you might think, great, a solution for difficult births, and in some cases, forceps did save lives, but they also came with significant risks. Without proper understanding of asepsis, that is, the importance of a clean environment, infection was a major concern. Forceps deliveries could lead to tearing, hemorrhaging, and even death for both mother and baby. And of course, the risk of brain damage to the baby wasn't fully appreciated. But, and this is a big but, in an era where difficult labor often meant certain death, the possibility of intervention was incredibly appealing. So slowly, male doctors begin to argue that their anatomical knowledge and access to tools like forceps made them better equipped to handle childbirth than midwives. It's a persuasive argument, especially to the wealthy and powerful families who could afford their services. And speaking of powerful families, court physicians who were almost exclusively male started attending royal births. This lends a lot of credibility to male practitioners. If the king's doctor is good enough to deliver the heir to the throne, maybe male doctors aren't so bad after all, right? It trickles down, but let's not paint too rosy of a picture, because there was resistance, and for good reason. Midwives had centuries of experience, they understood the rhythms of childbirth, and they provided crucial emotional and social support to women during labor. Many women simply preferred the care of another woman, someone who understood their bodies and their fears. Also, let's be honest, there was a pretty big dose of sexism at play here. Male doctors were often viewed with suspicion, even disgust. The idea of a man attending a woman in such an intimate and vulnerable state, well, for many it was simply unacceptable. There were whispers about impropriety, about men overstepping boundaries, about the very nature of childbirth being a woman's domain. And truthfully, many male doctors of the time were woefully ignorant about the practical aspects of childbirth. Their training was often heavily focused on theory and anatomy, but they lacked the hands-on experience that midwives possessed. There are accounts of doctors making interventions that were frankly dangerous, simply because they didn't understand the natural progression of labor. So this creates a real tension, a battle, almost, between tradition and innovation, between female knowledge and male authority. It's not a clean break, it's a messy, uneven process that unfolds differently in different places and among different social classes. In some areas, male doctors gain a foothold relatively quickly, especially among the elite. In others, midwives continue to dominate for generations, and it's not just about who is attending the birth, it's also about where. Childbirth, traditionally a home-based event, starts to slowly move towards hospitals, particularly in urban areas. This is partly driven by the rise of medical institutions and partly by the increasing availability of medical technology, like, yes, those intimidating forceps. Hospitals, however, weren't exactly beacons of cleanliness in the 17th century. They were often overcrowded, poorly ventilated, and rife with infection. Childbirth in a hospital could be a risky proposition, especially for poorer women who couldn't afford private rooms and were often relegated to overcrowded wards. So where does all this leave us? In a state of transition, really. The seeds of change are being sown, but the harvest is still a long way off. Midwives remain the primary caregivers for most women, but the influence of male doctors is growing, particularly among the wealthy and in urban centers. New technologies, like forceps, offer the potential for life-saving interventions, but also carry significant risks. And the shift from home-based birth to hospital birth raises new questions about safety, access, and the overall experience of childbirth. The landscape is changing, slowly but surely. It is an exciting, terrifying, and completely revolutionary time. To step into the worn shoes of a 17th century midwife. It's a life steeped in purpose, yes, but far removed from the sterile environments and scheduled appointments we associate with childbirth today. Imagine, if you will, a typical day. It likely begins long before sunrise, with the crowing of the rooster barely audible over the snores of her own family. Her home, modest perhaps, but always meticulously clean, a reflection of the order she brings to the often chaotic world of birth. Before the sun fully crests the horizon, she's already tending to her own household duties. Perhaps she's stirring a pot of porridge, the simple, sustaining breakfast that will fuel her through a long day. Maybe she's mending clothes, each stitch a quiet act of care and practicality. There's a stillness to these early hours, a sense of preparation for the demands that lie ahead. But this quiet doesn't last long. A knock on the door, perhaps, or a young boy dispatched by a worried husband, his face etched with concern. A summons. A woman is in labor, and her time has come. Gathering her things is a ritual, a sturdy woven basket, its contents carefully arranged, linen cloths, clean and soft, a small assortment of herbal remedies, tansy for soothing aches, pennyroyal, thought to aid delivery, and poppy syrup, a powerful, albeit risky, pain reliever, a horn spoon for administering medicines, a small sharp knife for cutting the umbilical cord, and of course her most valuable tools, her skilled hands and her calming presence. Her journey to the expectant mother might be on foot, navigating muddy lanes and uneven cobblestone streets. Or perhaps she's fortunate enough to have a donkey or a small cart, bumping along rutted roads that test her resilience. Each step is a prayer for a safe passage, for a smooth delivery, for the well-being of both mother and child. The birthing chamber, typically a room within the woman's home, is prepared with care. It's often the warmest, most private space available. A fire crackles in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The room is filled with familiar scents, beeswax candles, the aroma of brewing herbs, and the comforting smell of well-worn linen. The midwife's first task is to assess the situation. She observes the woman, listening to her descriptions of the pains, feeling her abdomen to gauge the baby's position. Her years of experience are her guide. She looks for signs of distress, for indications of potential complications. Is the labor progressing normally? Is the baby positioned correctly? Is the mother strong enough to endure? She offers words of comfort and encouragement, a gentle hand on the woman's brow. She consults with the family, explaining what she anticipates, preparing them for the long hours ahead. She might suggest a warm bath, or a gentle massage with infused oils. She encourages the woman to walk if she can, to find positions that ease the pain. The labor itself is a test of endurance for both the mother and the midwife. Hours can stretch into days, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun. The midwife remains a constant presence, offering sips of water, wiping the woman's brow, whispering words of encouragement. She employs all her skills, herbal remedies to ease the pain, gentle manipulations to guide the baby's descent, and unwavering emotional support. As the delivery nears, the atmosphere intensifies. The midwife, with her steady hands and focused gaze, guides the woman through each contraction. She knows when to push, when to rest, when to call upon the strength that lies within. And then, finally, the moment arrives. A cry pierces the air, a sound of new life, of hope, of promise. The midwife carefully catches the newborn, cleanses its face, and wraps it in soft linen. She places the baby in the mother's arms, a moment of profound connection, of pure, unadulterated joy. But her work is far from over. She cuts the umbilical cord, ties it securely, and attends to the afterbirth. She cleanses the mother, ensuring she is comfortable and warm. She monitors for signs of excessive bleeding, a common and dangerous complication. Then comes the quiet observation. The midwife stays with the mother and child for several hours, sometimes even days, providing support and guidance. She helps the mother to breastfeed, sharing her knowledge of proper latch and positioning. She offers advice on caring for the newborn, from swaddling techniques to soothing colic, and then when she is satisfied that both mother and child are stable, she prepares to leave. She offers final words of advice, a gentle reminder to rest and nourish herself. She gathers her basket, now a little lighter, and steps back into the world, carrying with her the weight of responsibility and the joy of witnessing a new life enter the world. But her day is not yet done. She may be called to another birthing chamber, to another woman in need, or perhaps she returns home, weary but fulfilled, to tend to her own family, to prepare for the next summons, the next birth, the next miracle. This cycle will continue, Her life is a constant ebb and flow, a rhythm dictated by the needs of her community. It's a life of sacrifice, yes, but also a life of profound meaning. For in the 17th century, the midwife was not just a caregiver, she was a pillar of strength, a beacon of hope, a guardian of life itself, and that in itself is a legacy worth remembering. Alright, let's put 17th century childbirth into a bit of historical context. It's easy to see it as uniquely brutal, but understanding how it compares to other eras really highlights both the progress we've made and the enduring challenges women have faced. Let's rewind even further, say to ancient Egypt or Greece. We know from archaeological finds and surviving texts that childbirth was also a largely female-dominated domain. Midwives, or their equivalent, were the primary attendants. Herbal remedies were employed, some with genuine pain-relieving properties, others, well, less so. The focus was heavily on appeasing the gods and goddesses associated with fertility and safe delivery. What's really interesting is that some surgical interventions, like versions of caesarean sections, were attempted, though almost invariably they resulted in the death of the mother. So while the 17th century lacked modern surgical techniques, at least the expectation of invasive intervention wasn't quite as prevalent as it was in some earlier periods. Now think about the Roman Empire. They actually had a slightly more developed understanding of anatomy than some later periods, thanks to figures like Galen, whose ideas, even if often inaccurate, held sway for centuries. Roman women of the elite classes sometimes had access to male physicians, although midwives remained the norm. Public health measures, like aqueducts providing clean water, might have indirectly improved maternal health, but childbirth itself remained perilous. Infant mortality was again tragically high. Moving into the Middle Ages, things get, well, a bit murky. The focus shifted even more heavily toward religious explanations for pregnancy and childbirth. Superstition intertwined with practical remedies. Medical knowledge, particularly from the classical era, was often lost or misinterpreted. Midwives retained their central role, but their knowledge base was largely empirical, passed down through generations of experience. Childbirth was seen as a deeply spiritual and frankly dangerous event, a direct consequence of Eve's sin. Pain was considered inevitable, a punishment to be endured. Interestingly, the Renaissance, while a period of great intellectual and artistic flourishing, didn't immediately revolutionize childbirth. Anatomical understanding improved with figures like Vesalius, but this knowledge didn't necessarily translate into safer childbirth practices for most women. Midwives continued to be the primary caregivers, and the birthing chamber remained a largely female space. However, the seeds of change were being sown. The printing press allowed for wider dissemination of medical texts, including those related to obstetrics, which would eventually challenge traditional midwifery practices. Compared to the 18th and 19th centuries, the 17th century occupies a fascinating middle ground. The rise of male physicians, or man midwives, was just beginning in the late 1600s, particularly in wealthier circles. This shift would become much more pronounced in the following centuries, leading to a gradual professionalization of obstetrics, but also to a decline in the autonomy and status of midwives. The introduction of forceps in the 18th century, while potentially life-saving in certain situations, also led to new forms of iatrogenic injury, that is, injury caused by medical intervention. The 19th century saw significant advances in medicine, like the development of anesthesia, think chloroform, and the germ theory of disease, which revolutionized hygiene practices. However, these benefits weren't evenly distributed. Poorer women, particularly in urban areas, still faced appalling conditions during childbirth, with high rates of infection and maternal mortality. Wealthy women, on the other hand, could access better medical care, including pain relief and improved sanitation. So in essence, the 17th century was both better and worse than what came before and after, depending on your perspective. It lacked the surgical enthusiasm, if that's the right term, of some earlier periods, but also lacked the pain relief and germ theory that would emerge later. It was a time of transition, with the old ways of midwifery slowly being challenged by new, often male-dominated, approaches to childbirth. The high rates of infant and maternal mortality, the lack of effective pain relief, and the reliance on superstition and herbal remedies all painted a picture of a very different, and often very difficult, experience compared to modern childbirth. But it was also a time when women supported each other, when childbirth was recognized as a natural, albeit dangerous, part of life, and when the knowledge of generations of midwives formed the bedrock of care. It really makes you think, doesn't it? All right, let's settle in and hear directly from the women of the 17th century. We've talked around them enough. It's time to actually listen to their experiences. You know, it's easy to get lost in the historical facts, the details of medical practice, the societal expectations, but behind all that, there were people going through these experiences, real women with their own fears, their own hopes, their own pain, and thankfully, some of them left us a record. One of the biggest challenges in understanding childbirth in the past is actually finding those voices. After all, women weren't always encouraged to write about, well, anything, let alone something as intimate and often considered shameful as childbirth. But through diaries, letters, and even the occasional medical case study, where a woman's words are recorded, we do get glimpses. One of the most compelling sources we have are personal letters. Women often wrote to family, especially their mothers or sisters, detailing their pregnancies and deliveries. These letters, sometimes spanning months between postings, offer an ongoing account of their experiences. Imagine receiving a letter detailing weeks, maybe months of discomfort. It puts those short text updates about discomfort into a new light. For instance, we have fragments from the correspondence of Lady Anne Clifford, a prominent figure in 17th century England. While her writings don't go into explicit detail about the birthing process, as was common for the time, she does document her physical struggles, her fears for her child's health, and her reliance on prayer. You can feel the anxiety in her words, the constant worry that something might go wrong. There are allusions to confinement, to feeling weary and worn, and of seeking comfort in faith. And then there are the diaries. These provide more of a day-to-day glimpse, though often filtered through a specific lens. Diaries from wealthier women might focus on the preparations, the ordering of fine linens, the visits from doctors or learned midwives. Diaries from those in more modest circumstances might focus on the physical labor that continued right up until the very end of the pregnancy, and on the struggles to find enough food to nourish themselves and their unborn child. One example, though a bit later than our time frame, gives us a good insight. The Diary of Martha Ballard, a midwife in 18th century America, is an absolute treasure trove. Although she writes primarily about the births she attends, she also provides glimpses into her own pregnancies and childbirth experiences. What's so special is that these aren't flowery poems, but rather a straightforward account of work she did and services she provided. But what about getting truly inside their heads? It's tricky. Women weren't necessarily writing for us, for posterity. They were writing to confide in loved ones, to record events, or perhaps to grapple with their own emotions. So what they don't say is often just as important as what they do say. We have to read between the lines, looking for those small details that reveal the deeper emotions. For example, a seemingly simple phrase like, "I pray God grant me strength," can reveal a deep-seated fear of death. A description of a midwife's kindness might suggest the lack of support or empathy from the woman's own family. And what about the silences? What wasn't written down? The pain, the fear, the sheer physical exhaustion. It's often in these silences that we can truly sense the weight of their experiences. It's like trying to imagine the taste of something wonderful you have never tasted. We also need to acknowledge the class differences. The experiences of a wealthy woman, attended by a physician and surrounded by servants, were vastly different from those of a poor woman, relying solely on the care of a local midwife and forced to work until the very last moment. These letters and diary entries reveal these vast differences, showing the impact of social class on every aspect of the birthing experience. For example, records show that wealthy women could often afford better food, better lodgings, and more consistent medical care both during pregnancy and after. They were also more likely to have help with childcare and household chores, which allowed them to recover more quickly. Poor women, on the other hand, often faced malnutrition, inadequate housing, and the constant pressure of work. They often had to return to physical labor soon after giving birth, which could lead to serious health problems. So how do we honor these voices? By listening closely, by reading carefully, by acknowledging the limitations of the sources, by understanding the context in which these women lived and wrote, and by recognizing that, despite the centuries that separate us, their experiences resonate with women today. Childbirth, in its essence, remains a deeply personal and transformative experience, one that connects women across time and cultures. By carefully examining these documents and considering the social context, we can begin to understand the physical, emotional, and spiritual challenges women faced during this time. And remember, these letters and diaries are often all we have to truly understand what women experienced when they became mothers centuries ago. The actual accounts of these experiences, even if fractured and partial, can provide us with insights we would never gain in history books alone. And really, by amplifying these voices, we can perhaps even create a stronger sense of connection with our own female ancestors, women who endured a very different world, but who still shared the same basic human experience of bringing new life into the world. Let's remember these accounts when we consider the realities that women faced during this period. It brings the facts to life, humanizing this era in a way that simple statistics cannot. All right, let's gently wade into the thornier side of things, the ethics. It's easy, centuries later, to look back and judge the practices surrounding 17th century childbirth through our modern lens, isn't it? But it's simply not fair. We must remember that they were operating within a completely different framework of knowledge, resources, and frankly, acceptable risk. Imagine trying to explain the concept of informed consent to someone living in a time where a woman's role was largely defined by her duty to procreate. The very idea that a woman might have the agency to refuse a particular treatment or even refuse to bear children would have been, utterly revolutionary and likely seen as a defiance of God's will, of social order itself. We must be mindful of the world the women were in and how that shaped their and the decisions of others around them. Think about the power dynamics at play. A woman, particularly a poor woman, often had little say in her own medical care. Her husband, her family, even the local clergy might have weighed in on decisions regarding her pregnancy and childbirth, often based on what they believed was best for the family, for the community, or even for her soul. A midwife, while often experienced and well-intentioned, was still bound by the prevailing social norms and medical beliefs of the time. She may have genuinely believed that a particular herbal remedy, however ineffective or even harmful, was the best course of action, and she might have faced considerable pressure from the family to administer it, regardless of her own doubts. Then there's the issue of pain. We have in our modern era access to effective pain relief during childbirth. Epidurals, analgesics, even the option of a cesarean section for particularly difficult labors. These are luxuries that women in the 17th century simply couldn't even dream of. The understanding of pain, its management, and its very purpose was vastly different. Pain was often seen as an unavoidable, even necessary, part of childbirth, a testament to a woman's strength, a form of penance for Eve's original sin, and of course it was simply accepted as an unchangeable truth. So when we talk about the ethical considerations of the era, we need to acknowledge that the very concept of what constitutes ethical was different. What we would consider a violation of bodily autonomy or a neglect of patient well-being might have been seen as perfectly acceptable, even laudable, within the context of 17th century society. Consider, for example, the practice of laying on of hands. This was a common practice involving the midwife or other women present, placing their hands on the laboring woman's abdomen, often while reciting prayers. While this might seem harmless, even comforting, we need to consider the potential for infection, given the lack of hand washing and general hygiene of the time. Was this practice truly for the benefit of the mother, or was it more about fulfilling a religious or social obligation? And did the mother have the right to refuse this blessing, even if she suspected it might be unsanitary? Or what about the use of certain herbal remedies? Many of these remedies, while based on centuries of tradition, were never scientifically tested and could have had dangerous side effects. Some, like ergot, were used to induce labor or control postpartum bleeding, but could also cause severe contractions, fetal distress, and even maternal death if not administered carefully. Was the midwife fully aware of the risks involved? Did she adequately explain these risks to the woman and her family? And if she did know the risks, did she have any other options available? Remember, she was often operating with limited knowledge and even more limited resources. And let's not forget about the superstitions that surrounded childbirth. Beliefs about evil spirits, curses, and the influence of the moon were widespread and often dictated the course of treatment. A woman might be forced to wear amulets, drink potions, or undergo other rituals based on these beliefs, even if she found them unsettling or illogical. Did she have the power to resist these practices, especially if her family believed that her refusal would endanger her and her child? Perhaps the biggest ethical dilemma of the era was the stark reality of infant mortality. The death of a newborn was a tragically common occurrence and often accepted as an unavoidable part of life. But what responsibility did the midwife or the family have to prevent these deaths? Did they have a moral obligation to try every possible remedy, even if it meant resorting to potentially harmful practices? Or was it simply God's will, a fate that could not be altered? And how did these high rates of infant mortality affect the emotional well-being of women who were constantly facing the possibility of losing their children? Ultimately, examining the ethical considerations of 17th century childbirth requires a delicate balancing act. We need to acknowledge the limitations of the era, the prevailing social norms, and the lack of scientific knowledge. But we also need to recognize the inherent value of human life, the importance of bodily autonomy, and the right of every woman to make informed decisions about her own health. It's not about judging the past, but about understanding it and learning from it. And maybe, just maybe, appreciating how far we've come, even as we acknowledge that there's still work to be done to ensure that every woman has access to safe, respectful, and ethical care during pregnancy and childbirth. And with all that being said, let's turn toward what a typical birth actually looked like in this era. And so we arrive at the final reckoning, the point where we try to understand the enduring impact of 17th century childbirth. It's easy, isn't it, to look back through our modern lens with all our medical advancements and perhaps feel a sense of, well, maybe pity or even horror at what women endured. But that would be a disservice, a profound one, to the women who lived through it and to the complexities of their world. What's truly striking when you delve into the details is the sheer resilience of women. Despite the very real dangers, the pain, the fear, they continued, generation after generation, to bring new life into the world. They were, in many ways, the bedrock of society, their bodies bearing the future, even as their lives were often circumscribed by social and cultural expectations. It's a strength, a quiet determination, that deserves our utmost respect. And beyond the individual strength of women, we see the strength of community. Childbirth wasn't a solitary event, something confined to a sterile hospital room. It was a communal experience, a gathering of women sharing knowledge, offering support, both practical and emotional. Midwives, of course, were central figures, their knowledge passed down through generations, a blend of practical skill and folk wisdom. They were trusted members of the community, offering a vital service in a world where medical expertise was scarce. Think about the social networks that formed around childbirth. The shared experiences, the rituals, the traditions, they created bonds between women, strengthening the fabric of society. These weren't just isolated events, they were integral parts of the community's life, shaping its beliefs and practices. They were lessons to the young and support for the mothers. It's also important to recognize the limitations of our own perspective. We might recoil at the lack of modern pain relief, the perceived superstitions, but we have to remember that these women were operating within a very different framework of understanding. Their beliefs, their practices were often rooted in a deep faith, a trust in God's will, a belief in the power of prayer and ritual. And while we might see these things as unscientific, they undoubtedly provided comfort and solace in a time of great uncertainty. We can also see the enduring influence of 17th century childbirth practices on the development of modern medicine. While we've moved away from many of the herbal remedies and superstitions, the core principles of midwifery, the importance of careful observation, of providing emotional support, of respecting the woman's body, are still relevant today. And in recent years, there's been a growing movement to reclaim some of these traditional approaches, to create a more holistic and woman-centered approach to childbirth. Consider, too, the lessons we can learn about the importance of social support during pregnancy and childbirth. In our increasingly individualistic society, it's easy to overlook the need for community, for connection. But the experiences of women in the 17th century remind us that childbirth is not just a medical event, it's a social, emotional, and spiritual one. And that women need support, understanding, and encouragement from those around them. And beyond the purely practical, there's a deeper, more philosophical reflection to be had. Childbirth in any era is a powerful reminder of the fragility of life, of the miracle of creation. It's a moment of profound vulnerability, but also of immense strength. And by studying the experiences of women in the 17th century, we can gain a greater appreciation for the enduring human capacity for hope, for resilience, and for love, even in the face of adversity. So what's the enduring impact? It's not just about medical history or social history. It's about understanding the human condition, about recognizing the strength and resilience of women, about appreciating the importance of community, and about remembering the fragility and beauty of life. It's about understanding how those women, living in a world so different from our own, still shared the same fundamental human experiences: the joy of new life, the pain of loss, the fear of the unknown, and the enduring power of love. And in understanding their experiences, we can gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and of the shared human story that connects us all, across time and across cultures. It's a reminder that even in the face of hardship, of danger, of uncertainty, the human spirit can endure, and that the cycle of life continues, generation after generation, a testament to the enduring power of hope and the resilience of the human heart. So let us remember them, not with pity, but with respect, with admiration, and with a deep appreciation for the legacy they left behind. A legacy of strength, of community, and of the enduring power of the human spirit. And on that quiet thought, it's time for rest. Good night.